Chapter 21. Note, hey guys. I'm so sorry it took me so long to post another chapter. I've missed writing this story so much. I will post more often from now on, I promise. Thank you so much for reading. 3. Madam Hooch had to go to her office for a few moments, or what, Potter? Malfoy retorted, a smug grin clear on his face. Harry's emerald eyes flashed angrily, and Malfoy said, well, if you want this toad, you can have it, as he threw it as hard as far as he could. Neville gasped in horror, tears streaming down his slightly chubby face, while Hermione and Mary held on to each side of him, both trying to comfort him as well as trying to control their nerves. Mary suddenly had a flashback to her youth. Mary, her mother shrieked as 8-year-old Mary came into the house from riding her broomstick. Yes, Mum, she asked, looking nervous. Her mother hissed at her, saying, I thought I told you that you can't ride your broomstick until after you cleaned the kitchen. But Mum. I did clean the kitchen, but she was interrupted, as her mother said, no you did not. I still see spots of dirt on the sink, and you didn't put the dishes away. But Mum. I can't reach the cupboards. Then her mother slapped her across the face, saying, do you have a brain in that small head of yours? You can use a ladder like the rest of us do when we can't reach things. Mary had tears in her eyes, and now a red mark on her cheek as she said, why yes, Mum. Her mother sighed and said, now get out of my sight, no more flying your broom for today. Mary ran to her small bedroom, and closed the door behind her before bursting into tears. She cried for a few minutes, wishing she could get away from her awful mother, and wishing that she could fly away, and be free. A few tears flowed down her cheek, and Hermione noticed, causing her to put her hand on Mary's shoulder, asking quietly, are you all right? Mary looked surprised, and nodded before quickly wiping away her tears as she said, yes, I'm fine, thanks. Hermione didn't believe her, but decided not to press any more questions, as now she was also concerned about Harry and how many school rules he was currently breaking. Harry zoomed past Malfoy. He felt his heart pounding so rapidly in his chest, that he could also feel it in his ears. He saw the poor little toad, flailing its little webbed arms and legs as it flew, and slowly started falling. Harry reached out his hand, and he got closer and closer to it until he finally caught it. He stopped on his broom in midair. Little did he know he was right in front of the window to Professor McGonagall's office, and looked down at Trevor, who seemed to be relieved he was no longer flying through the air. Harry then gave a large grin as he descended towards the ground slowly, and the whole class was running towards him, cheering. He landed on the ground, and was surrounded by smiles, high fives and pats on the back. He grinned as he saw Neville, whose face was pink from crying, smiling as Harry handed him Trevor carefully. Thank you, Harry. Neville said as he looked gratefully at him, and Harry said sure with a smile in return. Just then a strict voice said Harry Potter, causing Harry to cringe, as he recalled that tone of voice from his childhood. He turned around to see Professor McGonagall approaching the class, wearing an unreadable expression as she hastened. Mr. Potter. Please come with me. She said sternly, and Harry bowed his head in shame as he obeyed. As he left, he heard snickers coming from Malfoy, Crabbe and Goyle, and groans coming from the other students. Harry started to say Professor McGonagall, But she interrupted, saying not a word, Harry. I don't want any explanations at this time. Harry began to feel nervous as they walked through the castle, and when McGonagall finally stopped in front of a classroom, she said wait here as she walked inside. He heard her ask, pardon me Professor Flitwick, but would you mind if I borrowed Mr. Wood for a moment? He then heard a slightly squeaky voice reply in return, no trouble at all Professor McGonagall. Go ahead, Wood. McGonagall then seemed to have a small smile as she said, both of you follow me to my office. Once they reached her office, she motioned for them to sit down, and said excitedly, Oliver, I have found you a seeker. Oliver looked giddy, while Harry looked confused. 2 hours later in the dining hall. Bloody hell, Harry. You're the new seeker for the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Wicked, said Ron excitedly, stuffing his mouth with a ham sandwich. Hermione said, well really you're lucky she didn't give you a detention, you broke at least 5 school rules. But congratulations, Harry. Mary grinned as she said, oh I'm sure you'll be a wonderful seeker. Harry grinned sheepishly at all the compliments from his friends, and said, thanks guys, I hope I'll be decent enough at it, Oliver said he was going to teach me the basics about Quidditch tonight. Ron said, "Oh, come off it, Harry. You will be a great seeker. You should have seen the look on Malfoy's face earlier when you caught Neville's toad." Mary nodded with a grin as she said he looked so horrified. They all started to laugh, when suddenly Hedwig swooped in, and dropped a letter in Harry's lap. Harry said, "Thanks, Hedwig," as he stroked her feathers gently, and opened the letter. It read, "Hello, sweetie. Oh, congratulations, dear. Auntie emailed me as soon as she could about you making the Gryffindor Quidditch team. I'm so proud of you. Your father would have been so proud too. He was on the team in his time at Hogwarts. I'm sure you'll do us all proud, dear. I'll be there for your first game. Love. Mum." Harry smiled, and Ron asked, "What is it?" Harry said Mum wanted to congratulate me, and she said that my dad was on the team when he was here too. Ron's eyes widened as he said whoa, and Hermione said it must run in the family, then. Harry nodded with a grin, thought I hope I'll be as good as my dad was. That evening, Oliver explained the basic points of Quidditch, as well as Harry's duty as the Seeker. A week later. "Harry, you really should eat something. You can't play Quidditch on an empty stomach," said Mary. Harry, who was feeling nervous for the big game today, said, "Sorry, I'm just not very hungry." Hermione said, "Oh, you'll be fine, Harry. I know you're nervous, but..." Ron interrupted, "Talking with a mouth full of bacon, you have nothing to worry about. You know Fred and George will be there too, right? And plus if your dad was a great Quidditch player, you will be too." Harry smiled at his friends, and said thanks, but then a snide voice behind them said, "Mr. Potter, I would wish you luck for today's game, but it seems you don't need it." The students all looked questioningly at Professor Snape as he said this, then continued, saying, "If you can take on a mountain troll, a little game of Quidditch should be comparatively easy, shouldn't it?" As he walked away, Ron snorted as he said, "Ignore him, Harry. He's just being stupid. You'll do great." Harry gulped nervously as he said, "I hope you're right." Raising Harry, Chapter 22. Harry was on his way to the Gryffindor Quidditch locker room, when suddenly he heard a voice call from behind him, ask Harry, "Could I see you in my office for a moment?" Harry recognized the voice, and turned around to see Professor McGonagall, and he was about to object, but she cut him off, saying, "I know you need to get down to the match, but this will only take a few minutes of your time." He nodded, and felt slightly nervous as he hoped he wasn't in trouble for something. He hurriedly followed her to her office, and when they arrived, McGonagall said, "It arrived later than I expected, but nonetheless I thought you might like to use it in today's match." Harry looked at her questioningly, but then he noticed an oddly wrapped parcel on her desk, and she said, "Well, go on then, open it, dear." Harry did so, and when he saw what it was, his emerald eyes widened. It was the most beautiful broomstick he had ever seen. He read the tale of it, and said aloud, "Nimbus 2000. He grinned as he said, "My own broomstick." He then turned around and hugged Professor McGonagall, who smiled as she said, "Yes, make sure you take good care of it, now off you go to the match." Harry grinned as he picked up the broom as he said, "I'll make you proud, I mean Professor." She smiled at him, her eyes shining brightly behind her horn-rimmed spectacles, and as he dashed off for the Quidditch field, she said softly, "You always do, my boy." Harry reached the field, quite out of breath as he ran the whole way there. He spotted Oliver pacing nervously, but seemed relieved once he saw Harry, and his eyes widened as he said, "There you are, Potter." "Whoa! Is that a Nimbus 2000? Harry grinned as he nodded enthusiastically, and Oliver said, "Bloody hell, that's great, Harry. We'll beat Slytherin for sure." Harry gulped nervously as he adjusted his circular-lensed glasses, and he followed the Gryffindor team as they waited in the corner of the field for the game to begin. Harry wondered if he'd see his mum, as well as his friends, in the crowd as he played. Meanwhile in the stands, Katrina dodged and ducked her way through the sea of students, scanning the crowd for her friend Arin. She was just about to give up searching, but suddenly she saw Hagrid waving her over, and she made her way over to him. When she finally reached him, she grinned as she said over the rowdy students, "Hagrid. How are you?" as they hugged briefly. He smiled through his thick beard, and said, "I'm all right, yourself?" Katrina said, "I'm great. I'm so proud of Harry. Oh. By the way, Hagrid, have you seen my friend Arin?" But she was interrupted by a tap on the shoulder. She turned around and saw her friend, and said Arin, as they hugged, and Arin said with a grin I couldn't resist. I was trying to find you too, but I figured if we couldn't find each other, we'd find Hagrid. They laughed, and Hagrid smiled as he said Arin. Good to see ya, haven't seen ya for a while now. Arin smiled as she hugged him and as they parted, said I'm sorry. Tutoring the students has been keeping me pretty busy. But I promise I will come visit you for tea soon. Hagrid nodded understandingly, and Katrina smiled at her two friends. Then she noticed three familiar faces a short distance away. It was Mary, Ron and Hermione. The trio all had grins on their faces as they searched the field for their friend, and Katrina made her way over to them. As she reached them, she said hello you three. They all turned around and grinned. Mary said Katrina, as they hugged. Katrina smiled, then went over to hug Ron and Hermione too as she asked how are you all? Everything going all right? Ron nodded, and said yeah. Brilliant actually, can't wait for Harry to start. Hermione nodded in agreement, and said I do hope he remembers the rules. Katrina and Mary chuckled, but Ron moaned as he said while putting a hand through his red hair frustratedly oh honestly Hermione. Katrina laughed, and Mary said I think Harry will do just fine. Katrina smiled and said me too though she had a look of worry in her hazel eyes as she hoped her son wouldn't get hurt. Back on the Quidditch field. Harry gulped nervously, and his heart was pounding rapidly in his chest as he stood with the Gryffindor team, waiting for the match to start. Oliver noticed Harry looked nervous, and asked all right there, Potter? Harry's emerald eyes had a look of excitement and nervousness as he looked to Oliver, but said yeah, I think so. Oliver nodded and said I was nervous my first game too, though I can't remember much of it. I took a bludger to the head within the first bit of the game. I woke up a week later, but don't worry Potter you'll be fine. Plus Fred and George will be there to back you up too. Harry nodded, now picturing himself getting hit in the head by a bludger and feeling even more nervous. Suddenly, Madam Hooch called the teams over to the center of the field. Harry took a deep breath, his palms now sweaty beneath his fingerless gloves and his heart racing. Now I want a nice, fair game from all of you. Madam Hooch said gruffly as she looked to both teams, who all mounted their brooms. She then blew her whistle as she tossed the quaffle in the air, and after she released the bludgers and golden snitch into the air, the game began. All the team members flew in all different directions, each team trying to score points for their house. Harry floated in midair, searching for that little golden ball with wings that seemed to be beating as fast as his heart at the moment. Back in the stands. Katrina, who wore Gryffindor colors though she was a Hufflepuff, a maroon sweater with a gold-colored scarf over a pair of dark jeans and brown boots, watched nervously as the game started. Hagrid kept an eye on Harry through his binoculars, and Arin, who was also a Hufflepuff dressed in Gryffindor colors, a gold-colored shirt underneath a maroon button-up sweater with black slacks and heels, watched in anticipation as well. Suddenly, Arin thought back to when she, Katrina and Lily were students at Hogwarts. When James and Lily started dating at the beginning of their 7th year, Lily, Arin and Katrina spent many afternoons doing their homework as James and Sirius played Quidditch on the field. Sometimes Remus and Peter would join in too. Hogwarts, Marauders era. Arin, Katrina and Lily were all busy working on their various homework assignments, despite James and Sirius nagging the three of them as well as Remus and Peter, to join the two of them. Remus said as he pushed his hand through his light brown hair sorry James I'm a bit busy with this potions essay, perhaps tomorrow. Katrina said yeah I'm working on Charm's homework, and you know I'm not much of a flyer. As she had a look of guilt, but when Remus smiled reassuringly at her, she blushed slightly as she smiled back. She pushed her dark hair behind her ears slightly nervously, and the two then quickly got back to work on their respective homeworks. James's hazel eyes pleaded with Lily's emerald ones, and she groaned as she said oh all right, just for today, you're lucky I got most of my homework done during lunch earlier. James grinned as he said I'm lucky for that, but I'm also lucky to have you, love. Lily smiled softly, and stood up, giving Katrina and Remus a smile before heading down to the Quidditch field to get a broom. Sirius kept teasing Arin about joining in, as the two of them had a history of flirting and taunting each other, even pranking each other. He said oh, Mystic, you scared that you can't beat me at a little game of Quidditch? Arin smirked as she said nah I just don't want to see you cry after I beat your sorry ass at it. They all laughed, and Sirius flew closer to her as he said oh come off it, join me for a bit of Quidditch and I'll leave you alone about it the next time James and I play. Erin sighed as she said mischievously, you'd better keep your word on that or you may find yourself being hit in the head by a bludger. Sirius grinned as he said, cross my heart, love. He didn't see her blush as she walked down to the field to get a broom and fly up to where they were waiting, as was Lily. She said with a smirk, you ready to have your ass handed to you? Sirius grinned as he said, we'll see about that, Mystic. James and Sirius played against Lily and Erin, and pretty soon the guys and girls were tied. Back to where we were. Erin? Katrina asked, concern shining in her hazel eyes. Erin asked home. Sorry Kat, I just remembered something from the old days. Katrina nodded understandingly, and asked, did it have anything to do with you and Sirius seriously flirting with each other, with a wink? Erin playfully shoved her friend with a slight blush as she said, maybe, and I also remember you and Remus having something going on too. With her own wink, and Katrina playfully shoved her friend in return, a blush creeping up into her cheeks. Soon the two friends' attention returned to the game, and watched anxiously to see what would happen. Mary, Hermione and Ron cheered for Gryffindor when they scored, but soon it seemed that Slytherin was winning. Suddenly, they all saw Harry speed by. He must have seen the snitch. He flew after it, reaching out his hand towards it, but then something happened that made Katrina feel sick. Harry's broom was out of control. He was soon being dragged around by the broom, and he was finding it hard to stay on it. Katrina watched in horror, as did Erin, Ron, Mary and Hermione, and Hagrid said, blimey. Someone is jinking Harry's broom. Hermione's eyes narrowed at where the teachers were sitting, and she noticed Snape's eyes were fixed on Harry, and he seemed to be saying something. She said to Ron and Mary, Snape is doing this. I have an idea, I'll be back. Mary said but she was ignored as Hermione went off to find Snape and somehow distract him. Katrina gasped as suddenly Harry was finally knocked off his broom, and was now holding onto the handle for dear life as he dangled from it in midair. She said, we have to do something. Erin was about to say something, but then she noticed Hermione was gone. She asked Ron and Mary, where did she go? Ron shrugged as he said, she has a mind of her own, that nutter. Hermione made her way to the teachers' seats, and managed to be below where they were sitting. Once she spotted Snape's feet from below, she whispered the spell Incendio, before rushing back to her spot with her friends. Soon Harry's Nimbus 2000 was no longer trying to throw him off, so he quickly got back on it and followed the Slytherin Seeker as they sought after the snitch. Hermione made it back to her friends just in time, and Ron and Mary noticed there was a small fire in the teachers' seats. They looked to Hermione both with awe and trying not to laugh at what she did. Katrina, Erin and Hagrid looked relieved that Harry was no longer in trouble, and they didn't notice the fire in the teacher's stand. Their eyes were instead fixed on Harry, and they watched as Harry and the Slytherin Seeker fought to teach for the snitch. Soon Harry was flying towards the ground, and the Slytherin Seeker was afraid he would crash, so he pulled upwards, but Harry continued. Just as he would have hit the ground, he pulled his broom upwards, and it was soon gliding about 1 foot from the ground, and Harry managed to stand on his broom as it glided. The crowd watched in awe, and Harry, whose heart was racing still, reached out for the snitch, and suddenly he fell forwards. He landed on the ground with an oomph, face down. Katrina gasped, but a moment later Harry got up shakily, and looked in his hand to find that he caught the snitch just before he fell. He grinned as he held it in the air, and Lee Jordan shouted into the microphone, and Gryffindor wins the match against Slytherin. Everyone cheered, except the Slytherins, and Harry stood proudly, grinning so much that his face started to hurt. In that moment of triumph, he felt that maybe, just maybe, he had made his parents proud of him. Raising Harry, Chapter 23. After Harry's first Quidditch match success in mid-November, things settled down a bit. Harry, Ron, Hermione and Mary had been doing well in all their classes, thanks to Hermione's reminders to everyone to finish their homework, as well as Miss Mystic helping them each with their studies when needed. Things had been going pretty smoothly for the 4 Gryffindor students, until one day, they came across something they shouldn't have, Fluffy. One day Harry, Ron, Hermione and Mary, who were also joined by Neville Longbottom, were on the changing staircases to hurry back to their dormitory to study. Suddenly, the staircase took a different turn, and they all looked at each other, with confused looks on their faces. Hermione said with a slight gasp, "This is the 3rd floor, Dumbledore said it was forbidden. Neville said with a slight tremble, we should probably go back down the stair, but he was cut off by a loud meow. The 5 students looked around until they spotted a long-haired, somewhat scruffy-looking brown cat. It stared at them intently with piercing golden eyes, and meowed loudly again. Startled, and knowing that Filch was probably not too far off, they ran as fast as they could to the nearest door they could find. Harry tried the doorknob, and said in a nervous tone, "It's locked." Hermione quickly pulled out her wand, and pointed it at the door, saying Alohomora, causing the door to open with a creak. The 5 students ran inside and closed the door until it was just a small crack to peer out of. Harry watched from the crack of the door the whole way carefully, and saw Filch carrying his lantern, and looked around for any slight movement. Then he looked to Mrs. Norris and said, "Come, my sweet, we'll find em." As Filch and Mrs. Norris set off in the opposite direction, the 5 children sighed in relief, but the relief didn't last long. The moment they turned around, they regretted it. There, standing 30 feet above them, was a very large, 3-headed black dog. Ron whimpered a little, Hermione and Mary held back gasps, Neville looked as if he might faint, and Harry gulped nervously. The dog began to growl, which was so loud the ground began to shake beneath them, so the 5 of them couldn't hold it back anymore. They all screamed and ran out the door as quickly as they could. Ron and Harry slammed the wooden door and locked it behind them as quickly as they could before all 5 of them ran back to the Gryffindor common room. They reached the portrait of the fat lady, quite out of breath and looking very pale, and Mary gave the password before they hurried inside. They were alone in the common room, thankfully, and they collapsed on the crimson sofas with exhaustion, thankful that they didn't become the 3-headed dog's next meal. They sat there for a few moments, catching their breaths before Hermione spoke up, asking did anyone else notice that that dog was sitting on some sort of door. The other 4 looked bewildered, and Ron said exasperatedly, "Oh, for Merlin's sake, Hermione. We were all trying not to get eaten by that dog. What made you think we'd pay attention to what it was sitting on?" Hermione glared at Ron, and Harry thought back to that moment, and remembered he did glimpse over something on the floor. He said, "Yeah, actually, I thought I saw something. But the question is, why would that dog be sitting on it, unless—" Mary finished his sentence as the thought popped in her head it was guarding something. Each of them had wide eyes as they thought about what was just said. Neville asked what could it be guarding? Ron shrugged and said, "Dunno. Treasure." Harry asked, "But why would Dumbledore, Professor Dumbledore, hide it here if it was treasure? Why not put it in Gringotts?" The 5 of them thought over this for a few minutes longer, before Hermione stood up and said, "Well, I don't know about you 4, but I'm going to go to bed before any of us come up with any more ideas to get us killed. Or worse, expelled." Mary smiled and rolled her eyes at her friend's sarcasm, and Ron, Harry and Neville looked as if they might laugh as they too headed to their dormitory. Ron told the other 2 boys as he shook his head, "She needs to sort out her priorities." They all chuckled as they went to their respective beds and got ready to sleep for the night. Before Harry fell asleep, he thought about what could be beneath that 3-headed dog. Surely it wasn't of much importance. Back at McGonagall Mansion with Katrina. Katrina had just finished eating some ice cream with cinnamon apples on top, her favorite midnight snack when she couldn't sleep. She was restless that night, thinking about a lot of things. In less than a month it would be Harry's first holiday from Hogwarts, and she wanted to make it special. She also thought about Sirius, and wondered how he was doing since she saw him about a month ago. She hoped that he was taking good care of himself. Just as she was washing and putting away her bowl and spoon, she heard a tapping on the window. The sound startled her and she almost dropped the bowl, but thankfully she caught it just in time. She placed it on the counter, and saw through the window there was a small brown owl. She let it inside, and it landed on the counter in front of her, a letter in its talons. She was about to stroke the owl's back, but it almost bit her. She jumped back, and said okay, thanks. As she took the letter and read it. "Dearest Katrina. Yes, before you worry, which I know you have been, I am all right. I'm sorry for the late reply, but it's been hard to track down an owl I could borrow to send you a note. I can't tell you how good it feels to be free, even if I am in hiding. I am now in Scotland, and have been enjoying the scenery. It's so beautiful out here, the open skies, the smell of nature, everything I took for granted before I was in you know where. And before you ask, Yes, I am taking care of myself. I hope that you are doing all right yourself. I will send you another letter as soon as I can. Love. Snuffles. Katrina smiled as she read the letter, grateful that Sirius was all right and was happy. She remembered that she made a loaf of bread the other day, and decided to wrap it up and send it to him, along with a letter of her own. She wrapped up the bread in some plastic wrap and then some brown parcel paper, and tied it up neatly with some string. She then scribbled a note and folded it neatly. She then realized that the owl's talons might pierce through the paper and get to the bread. She searched, and found a small paper bag that she put the bread and the note in. Before she gave it to the owl to deliver, she gave the owl a biscuit from a plate that she left out earlier. She told it, "Please give this to the man who sent me my letter." The owl ate the biscuit quickly and seemed to understand as it flew out the window. Katrina watched it fly into the moonlight, and hoped the letter would arrive quickly. She then closed the kitchen window and went to her bedroom to get ready to sleep. Later that morning, Sirius had woken up from his slumber in the forest, and as he sat up in his sleeping bag he noticed something flying in his direction. As it came closer, he recognized it as the owl he sent to Katrina the other night. The owl dropped the bag into his lap, and he saw something wrapped up, and a note. He opened the note first, which read, "Dear Snuffles. I'm so relieved to hear that you are safe. I have missed you so. Though I wish you didn't have to remain in hiding, I'm glad that you are enjoying your freedom. You deserve it. I'm sure it is lovely over there, and I hope that you can continue to see more beautiful sights. After the holidays coming up in less than a month, I do hope that you can visit me again. Please stay in touch. Love. Katrina. P.S. Here is a little something for you in case you're not eating enough. I can't imagine food is easy to come by too often, so whenever you send me a note I will send you something to eat." Sirius smiled as he opened the parcel. It was a loaf of country bread. He broke off a piece of it and began to eat it, and offered a little bit to the owl as well. As the owl finished and flew off, he thought about his next travels, and how glad he was that Katrina was his friend. Raising Harry, Chapter 24. A month later, the holidays started to take shape at Hogwarts. The smell of pine, fresh gingerbread, and peppermint filled the air, and the great hall as well as the rest of the castle was decorated beautifully. Exquisitely decorated Christmas trees were spotted around every corner, and the ornaments glittered in the candlelight that lit the castle. Harry smiled to himself as he saw all of this, as he knew it meant that he would soon go home to celebrate Christmas with his family. Part of him didn't want to leave Hogwarts, as he'd gotten so attached to his friends, including Hagrid, who he went to have tea with every month with Ron, Hermione and Mary, and Quidditch, but at the same time he felt homesick. As he sat down in the great hall to have dinner with his friends, he thought to himself, well, now would be the right time to ask, after all Mum did say I could do this, He asked the other three, so, any plans for the holidays? Hermione grinned and said, yes, I'm going home to celebrate the holidays with my family. I've missed them, so it'll be good to see them again. Harry smiled. He felt a little disappointed, but he was happy for her as he knew how she felt. Ron looked a little sad as he said, well, I'll be spending Christmas here I suppose. My parents and Ginny are off to see Charlie in Romania. I think Bill, Percy, Fred, and George will be going too. I just didn't really want to go this year. Harry frowned, and asked, are you sure? I don't want you to spend your Christmas at Hogwarts alone, Ron. Ron sighed and said, yeah, I just don't really feel like traveling. We've been going to Romania to see him at Christmas for the past 2 years, and I always feel a bit left out anyways. It's not intentional, it just happens. His ears turned pink, which indicated that he felt he said too much. Harry asked, with a slight nervous stutter, well, how would you like to spend Christmas with me? My mum wouldn't mind, and she makes the best gingerbread cookies and makes the holiday really nice. Ron looked surprised, and looked excited and nervous all at once as he asked, really? I don't want to be a burden though. Harry interrupted and said, trust me, you wouldn't be, with a grin. Ron grinned too and said, all right, sure. I'd love to. Thanks, Harry. Hermione smiled at both of them. Mary looked sadly down at her food, as she knew she'd be spending Christmas at Hogwarts. Her mum didn't want her to come home unless she really had to. Harry noticed that Mary seemed to be sad as she poked at her roasted potatoes with her fork on her plate. He asked with a look of concern, "Mary, are you all right?" Mary looked up suddenly as if knocked out of a trance, and said, "Oh yes, I'm fine." Harry asked, "Okay, well how about you? What are you doing for the holidays?" Mary said, trying to hide the sadness in her voice, "Well, Christmas was never really celebrated at my house. My parents just saw it as another day, and so I'll be staying here." Harry looked surprised and saddened all at once as he asked, "You mean, you've never celebrated Christmas before?" Mary shook her head no, and Ron and Hermione shared similar expressions to Harry as they looked to her. Harry asked, "Well, would you like to?" Mary nodded, and said, "I've always wondered what it was like, and Hogwarts has shown me part of what it's like, and I love it. I wish I knew what it was sooner. It's beautiful." Harry smiled a little as he said, "Come spend it with me, Ron, and my family then. Please. You shouldn't be by yourself here, and my mum would love it if you could come too." Mary looked shocked, and her eyes filled with tears as she said, "I'd love to. Are you sure you want me there?" Harry nodded with a smile, and she ran over and hugged him. He hugged her back, and after a minute she sat back down at her seat, and Hermione said, "Now I feel like I'm going to be missing something." They all laughed, and Hermione said after a few minutes, "Oh. But wait, with only one more week until holidays, that gives us little time to finish our research." Ron said with a heavy sigh, "What research? Don't you nag us about our schoolwork enough?" Hermione gave him a small glare, but said to them quietly, "Remember, Fluffy, we need to keep thinking about what could be underneath him, what he was guarding." Harry said, "Oh, yeah. I forgot about that." He started to ponder what could be behind that door. Surely something important. Could it be something that I know of but don't realize it yet? Suddenly, he thought back to his birthday, when he went to Gringotts, and remembered that Hagrid took a suspicious-looking little bag from the vault. Beforehand, didn't he mention something about it being the safest place, besides Hogwarts? Then a week later, he remembered reading the Daily Prophet about that very vault being robbed that same day they went. Surely that wasn't just a coincidence, but Hagrid didn't steal it. He kept thinking, what could the contents of that bag be? Surely that little bag couldn't be what Fluffy was guarding, it's so small, and it couldn't be that important, could it? Hermione said loudly, "Harry." Harry, causing him to snap out of his thoughts. He shook his head, and said, "Sorry, I was just thinking about something. I don't want to talk about it here, though." Mary suggested, "Why don't we go back to the common room?" They all nodded in agreement, looking curious as they walked up the stairs to the Gryffindor common room. As they all sat down, Harry looked around to make sure no one else was around, and he quietly told them all of what he was just thinking about. They all looked surprised, and Hermione was the first to speak, saying, "Even the smallest of things can have the biggest effect, Harry, especially for those who have magic. Even something the size of a coin can possess the greatest powers. It's part of what makes magic so wonderful and scary all at once. You'd be amazed at what you'd learn about from all the books I've read about magical objects." Ron interrupted and said, "Please don't educate us on all this now, Hermione, or we'll never get to leave the common room again." Harry and Mary laughed as Ron looked exasperated, and Hermione glared at him. Mary said, "I wonder what the object could be. It could be anything." Harry nodded and said, "Yeah, I've been trying to think about what it could be. Maybe we should ask Hagrid about it tomorrow. I don't think he'll want to tell us anything much, but he could give us a hint. It's worth a try, right?" They all nodded in agreement, and they continued to talk more before they went to their dormitories and went to bed. The next day, after classes were finished for the day, the four kids went to see Hagrid for their monthly afternoon tea. Hagrid greeted them all warmly and made sure that each of them had their cups of tea and that each had a big slice of his fudgy chocolate cake. As they began, Harry thought, "Well, here it goes," and asked Hagrid, "So, Hagrid, do you remember when we went to Gringotts this past summer?" "Well, I just remembered that I never asked, but what was it that you had to get?" Hagrid looked surprised, and said, "What brought THA up?" Harry said, blinking his emerald eyes innocently, "Just curious. I thought it was strange that it was such a big vault, and all that was in there was that little bag. It can't be that important, can it?" Hagrid chuckled nervously and said, "Well, Harry, I can say, it's kinda a private matter between me and Professor Dumbledore, sir. And Nicholas Flamel, of course." They all looked surprised, and Hermione asked first who was Nicholas Flamel. Hagrid looked horrified for a minute, and muttered under his breath, "I shouldn't have told ya that." He then got up quickly and asked, "So, anyone need any more tea?" They all shook their heads no as they sipped their tea and thought about what he said, while Hagrid was lecturing himself in his mind. They then continued to talk about schoolwork and other small topics until they had to leave, and before they left, Hagrid said, "Listen now, don't ya be reading into what I said earlier, alright? It's of no concern to ye, it's important tha ye keep it secret, I could lose me job if anyone finds you I told ye, okay?" They all nodded understandingly, and said their goodbyes and thank yous to the friendly half-giant. Hagrid sighed with relief as he closed the door and sat on the couch next to Fang, and said tha was a close on, eh? Fang panted, and Hagrid pat him on the head as he went to clean up the table. Shortly after they arrived back in the Gryffindor common room. They talked about what Hagrid said, and agreed to look into the name Nicholas Flamel in the library the next day. Before Harry left for dinner that night, he wrote a letter to his mum, which read, "Dear Mum. Great news. Ron and Mary will be joining us for the holidays this year. Hermione wanted to, but she wants to spend the holiday with her family. I can't wait to show them what holidays are like for us, I think they'll really like it. Mary hasn't celebrated Christmas before, so I can't wait for her to see as well. We had a nice tea with Hagrid today, he seems to be doing well. My classwork is going alright, though potions has been difficult to keep up with. Miss Mystic has been helping me and Ron keep up though, and Hermione never lets us forget to do homework and study. I can't wait to be home next week, see you soon. Love. Harry." Raising Harry, Chapter 25. Back to McGonagall Mansion. Katrina, who was dressed in a black t-shirt and pink pajama pants with her hair pulled up in a ponytail, was bleary-eyed when she saw Hedwig's form in the window. She awoke a moment ago to the sound of Hedwig's beak tapping on the window of her bedroom. She pulled her light pink robe on before opening the window and taking the letter from her talons. She thanked the owl, handing her a small treat. Katrina was more than happy to receive Harry's letter, and smiled as she read it. She thought to herself, "I can't wait to spoil them all this holiday." She was just thinking about all the possibilities of how to do just that when suddenly she heard a knock on the door. She thought, who could that be at this hour? As she looked to her clock, it read 12:15 a.m. She walked to the door, holding on to her wand in her robe pocket for safety, and opened the door. She gasped, it was Sirius. She hugged him almost immediately while grinning ear to ear, saying, "Oh, Sirius. I've missed you." He grinned as he said, "I've missed you too, Katrina," and hugged her back. She let go of him, smiling so much she knew her cheeks would hurt later. She then grabbed his hand and pulled him inside. As she shut the door, she said, "I can't believe you're here. But wait, you shouldn't have visited, Siri. You could get caught. Even here isn't safe, Professor McGonagall lives here too, and—" Sirius interrupted gently, saying, I know. I couldn't resist visiting when I knew I'd be passing through here." Katrina said, "Well, I'm glad you did." Sirius sighed and put his hand through his somewhat long, messy black hair as he said, "But I'm afraid I come bearing some sad news as well, love." Katrina looked confused, and asked, "What is it? Are you alright?" Sirius nodded and said, "Yes, I'm fine, but you see, I won't see you again for a while. I will be living somewhere where the Ministry hopefully won't catch up with me. Part of me is restless and wants to keep doing what I've been doing, seeing new places and narrowly avoiding the law, but I know I need to settle down, at least for a year." Katrina nodded understandingly, saying, "I understand, of course. That doesn't mean that I won't miss you though." She took his hand and held it as she added, "I wish you could stay here, but it's too much of a risk with McGonagall being here too." She frowned a little, and he squeezed her hand as he said, "I'll miss you too. I'll write you as often as I can, though. I promise." She smiled and said, "I'll hold you to that." He smiled back, and she asked, "How about you stay the night here? A nice, comfy bed and a nice breakfast before you leave." As she looked at him with hopefulness in her bright hazel eyes, he said, "I'm afraid I have to decline, as tempting as that is." It would be best if I traveled in the middle of the night in order to avoid any unwanted sightings. I've already seen my face plastered all over the Daily Prophet. Katrina nodded sadly. She too had seen the paper, even heard around town mentions of his name. The wizarding world had been practically buzzing since his escape, many people questioning how it was possible to escape Azkaban. It had never been done before. She too had wondered how he accomplished it but never questioned him, for she didn't want to make him relive his horrible experience again. She wondered if Harry had heard anything about it, and wondered if it would be time to tell him about his godfather sooner than she had hoped. She wanted Sirius to reunite with Harry for so long, and ached to tell him that Harry is with her and how he's doing, but she wanted Sirius to be able to get to know Harry as a free man. He deserved to get to know his godson without having to live in fear of the authorities catching up to him, and... Katrina. Are you all right? Sirius asked, interrupting her thoughts. She replied, Oh yes, I'm fine, sorry. I was just thinking about something. Anyways, would you like some tea before you have to go? He nodded and said, I'd love some, thank you. He sat down at the kitchen table, and she poured water into the kettle and started the burner on the stove. She suddenly had another thought that came to mind, and asked Sirius. Have you contacted Remus since your escape? Sirius looked surprised, and said, well, no, I didn't think he'd want to speak to me, after what happened. He probably blames me for the death of Peter and all those muggles as well. He looked sadly out the window, and both of them noticed that it was a full moon tonight. She sighed sadly and said, well, I wouldn't be so sure of that. Sirius looked confused, and said, oh. Why is that? Katrina took the boiling kettle off the stove, added the tea inside it, and sat down at the table while it steeped. She then said, well, I sent him a letter a few years ago, when I realized I had forgotten to tell him after that night. I told him that I firmly believed that you were innocent, and in his response he said that he was unsure, but I got the feeling that he believed me, at least a little. Sirius was surprised, and said, You did? Why? She said as she got up and began to pour the tea, because I didn't want him to lose faith in his best friend. He has to have some hope while dealing with his transformations, and... Sirius suddenly got up, walked quickly over to where she was standing, and just as she set the teapot down and said what, he hugged her. She was stunned for a moment, but hugged him back, with a small smile on her face. He said, thank you, Katrina. You have no idea how much that means to me, and how much it means to have someone who has believed in me for so long. Katrina said, what are friends for? Of course I stand by you. You stood by me, Lily and Aaron at Hogwarts, it's the least I can do for you now. He stood back, and smiled at her. She returned the smile, and handed him a cup of tea. He said thank you as she put a plate of oatmeal cranberry cookies on the table and soon joined him with her own cup of tea. They sat silently for a few minutes, sipping their tea and eating a cookie, or in Sirius's case, two. Sirius broke the silence, saying so, whatever happened to Aaron? Is she alright? Katrina sipped and put down her teacup, and then smiled as she said Aaron is just fine. During the war she went to live with her family, and then just last year she moved back home and is now teaching at Hogwarts. She's an assistant professor and tutors the students who need help. Sirius smiled and said the way that she always helped us with our homework so frequently, that doesn't surprise me. He looked deep in thought as he stared out the window, and Katrina smiled as she knew what he was thinking about, especially with that look on his face. She said Siri. You alright there? He snapped out of it, and replied OHM. Yeah, I'm alright. I was just thinking with a slight blush in his cheeks. He then cleared his throat, and put a hand through his black hair as he said unfortunately love, I should get going shortly. Before I know it, it'll be sunrise. Katrina looked at her watch, it read 2 a.m. She nodded, and said oh, yeah. I almost forgot. Sirius put down his tea, and stood up. She noticed he was dressed in a pair of dark jeans, a dark green t-shirt, a black leather jacket and a pair of dark sneakers. She wondered where he got them, but then remembered that he had an old hideout he kept when he was out doing missions for the Order and needed to sometimes lay low in undetected areas. He said thank you for the tea and your time, Kat. I really appreciate it. Katrina said as she walked him to the door I'm happy I could, and I'm so glad you stopped by. Oh. Hold on. She ran back to the kitchen, and grabbed a wrapped-up loaf of bread and a few apples from the counter, put them into a small bag and went back to him. She handed it to him and said, "This should last you for a day or two, please take care of yourself, Sirius. Be safe." She hugged him, and he hugged her back, and said, "I promise." He opened the door, and she waved goodbye with tears in her eyes as he walked out the door and turned back to face her. He smiled as he waved goodbye and said, "I'll be back before you know it." After she watched him disappear into the night, she closed the door and sighed. She would miss him, but she knew he was doing the right thing. She thought about Harry, and smiled softly to herself as she realized he would be home in just a couple days. She walked to the kitchen, thinking about him being finally home again, and how she could spoil him and his friends. She put all the dishes away and cleaned everything up before returning to her bedroom. She took off her robe and hung it up before curling up in bed next to her cat, who was fast asleep on the covers. As she drifted off to sleep, she reminded herself to get Harry's presents that day, and to pick out a couple things for Ron, Mary and even Hermione, who she would mail her gift to. Back at Hogwarts, later that morning, Harry couldn't believe that in just 2 days he'd be back home. He couldn't wait, and he looked forward to his friends being able to join him this year. Classes ended officially that day, and he talked to his friends excitedly about it at lunch that day. Many other students were discussing the very same thing, and what their holiday plans were. Layla and Crystal, two well-known bubbly and cheerful Hufflepuffs that seemed to make friends with everyone, chatted excitedly about their plans as well. Crystal asked, "So what are you going to do this year? Anything exciting?" Layla answered as she practically bounced up and down in her seat, "Yes. This year we're going to go to a special magical pet store in France where I can pick out my pet." Crystal said, "Oh my Merlin, that's so cool." Layla grinned and replied, "I know. How about you?" Crystal answered, "Well, we're going to be staying home this year, but we have a few fun traditions that we do that always make it feel like Christmas. We're going to go ice skating, get hot chocolate, have a Christmas movie marathon, things like that. It's so fun, and it always makes me so happy." Layla said, I love that. We'll be spending most of our holiday in France, but we have a friend who lives there and we will stay with her and probably help her decorate her tree and stuff, so that'll be cool." As the girls continued chatting, the owls started swooping in for the Daily Mail delivery. Erin, who had been wondering what she would be doing for the holidays, had a letter dropped into her lap. She smiled as she recognized her friend's handwriting, asking her to spend the holidays with her. She grinned as she wrote a reply back. Her family hadn't really been into celebrating the holidays, but when she and Katrina were young and attending Hogwarts, she would invite Erin to celebrate with her family. Those were the best holidays for her. They had a wonderful time every year, so it made her feel excited to experience it again. Raising Harry, Chapter 26. The day had finally arrived. It was time to Harry to go home and see his mum. He had been looking forward to this day for ages, and the fact that this year he would be spending his holiday with his new friends was even more exciting. He had just finished packing his trunk when Ron entered the dormitory and asked Harry, "All right there, Harry? Ready to go?" Harry answered, "Yeah." "You?" Ron replied, "Yeah. Just need to get my trunk." As he walked over to his bed and pulled his trunk off of it, he dragged it down the steps to the common room. Harry then did the same after shutting his trunk and grabbing Hedwig's cage. When they entered the room, they saw Mary quietly reading on the crimson sofa, her trunk sitting next to her. Harry grinned as he asked aloud, "We're all set, then?" Mary looked up from her book and nodded with a smile, and Ron grinned widely as he too nodded. Harry then said, "Right then, off we go. Let the holidays begin." They all cheered and made ready to leave. Back at McGonagall Mansion, Katrina had just added some finishing touches to the guest rooms for Ron, Mary and Erin. She couldn't stop smiling all morning, because not only would she have her son home again, but he also had new friends to share the holidays with. She too would get to have her own friend over for the holidays, though Erin had sent her an owl the other day saying that she'd arrive later than the latter, for she was behind on some work and grading and needed to catch up before the long break, but nonetheless she would be there. Katrina had prepared clean towels, sheets, and other necessities for each room. She even added a Christmas tree in each room to give them all a little surprise to find when they got settled in. She hadn't put the big Christmas tree up in the living room just yet, because she and Harry did it together every year and she didn't want him to miss out. Once she finished, she began cooking a hearty vegetable soup for dinner that night. As she was chopping some vegetables, she heard McGonagall come in and call out hello. Katrina replied Professor, as she put down the knife and ran to hug her. McGonagall said as she chuckled, it's good to see you too, my dear. Katrina grinned, oh I've missed you and Harry so much. Is he on the train now? McGonagall nodded and replied he should be at King's Cross in an hour, as well as Miss Black and Mr. Weasley. Katrina nodded, and as went back to the kitchen, McGonagall followed. Katrina's black cat was laying on the table as McGonagall sat down and pet him. Katrina smiled as she asked, would you like some tea, Professor? McGonagall said, goodness child. After all this time you're still referring to me as Professor and not Minerva. You have every right to address me as my friends and colleagues do. I believe you earned that right the moment we took in Harry. Katrina blushed of embarrassment as she answered, I guess I just felt it was sort of, well, improper not referring to you as I always have. But I would be honored to call you by your name, Prof. Minerva. McGonagall smiled, and said, but to answer your question, yes, a cup of tea would be lovely. Katrina returned the smile as she put the kettle on and added, and you know you have every right to call me Katrina rather than Miss Belmont, right? McGonagall chuckled and said, I suppose it's a habit of mine to refer to you as I do all my students, current as well as former. But of course, Katrina. Katrina grinned as she returned to cooking, though this time she was baking Harry's favorite Christmas biscuits. Once she finished about 40 minutes later, she took off her pale pink apron and grinned as she thought to herself, I'd say it's about time to pick up the kids. She told McGonagall as she slipped her black leather jacket on, well, I'm off to pick up the kids. I'll be back soon. McGonagall finished her tea and said as she turned a page in the Daily Prophet, be safe, dear. I'm sure King's Cross is packed with muggles. Katrina smiled as she said, I did always love the holiday bustle, as she chuckled to herself and apparated to the King's Cross entrance. At King's Cross, Harry, Ron, and Mary all got off the train, trunks and pets in tow. As they dragged their trunks to a clearing, they searched the massive crowd for Katrina. Katrina was just making her way through the massive crowds of people, looking for the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. As she pushed and dodged through muggles, she misstepped and found herself falling to the floor after a large man with a peculiar mustache bumped into her quite rudely. He grumbled to himself, young people today, never looking where they're going. She sighed as she got up, excuse me, I'm in a rush to pick up my son. He gave a HMPH, while his pencil-thin, long-necked wife looked down at her as if she had just smelled something foul. Katrina gave him a look as she picked herself up and walked away, muttering to herself sarcastically, well, aren't you Mr. and Mrs. Friendly, and thanks for helping me up too. She sighed, and turned as she watched them walk away talking, probably about her and her carelessness when it was him who bumped into her. She noticed that his wife had her bony arm wrapped around a boy that looked about Harry's age. They almost looked like characters out of a cartoon, and she snorted to herself as she thought, what an odd-looking lot, and they've got no sense of humor for people who look very comical. She then remembered, right, Harry and his friends are probably wondering where in Merlin's name I am, so she rushed to the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. As she ran through, a memory from her past washed over her. A flashback to the beginning of her last year at Hogwarts. Aaron, we're going to miss the train, come on. 17-year-old Katrina Belmont shouted to her best friend, who had spent the past week with her before their school year began. Aaron shouted back, okay sheesh, calm down for Merlin's sake, we're about to run through the barrier. Katrina grinned as she dragged her trunk with one hand and her carrier for her owl in the other, and rushed through to platform 9 3/4. Aaron was right behind her, also juggling her trunk and carrier. Katrina stopped for a minute, and said, this is it, our last year, Aaron. Can you believe it? Aaron said with a sigh, no, it feels like just yesterday we were two little girls, oh wait, we still are. They both laughed, and Katrina said, well, we're at least a little bit taller than we were when we started. The two giggled, but then the train suddenly sounded its horn, and as the sound pierced the air, Katrina was so startled she nearly fell over as she said, oh Merlin, we need to get our asses onto the train. Aaron and Katrina rushed to the door and thankfully were able to quickly make it on before the train parted a minute later. Once they settled into a compartment, they looked at each other and began to laugh. This was going to be a good year, they could feel it, even with the war going on. Back to where we were. She snapped out of the memory, and about 2 minutes later, she spotted Harry, Ron and Mary all huddled behind a barrier with their trunks and pets, searching the endless crowd for her. She waved frantically with the biggest grin on her face, and Harry spotted her and waved back just as excitedly. She once again dipped and dodged her way through the crowd, and then when she reached the kids, Harry excitedly, "Hi, Mum." Katrina grinned as she hugged him tightly and said, "Oh Harry. I missed you so much." Harry hugged her back and said, "Not as much as I missed you." Katrina smiled with a few tears in her eyes as she and Harry separated, and she said, "Oh, Mary. Ron," before running over and giving them both hugs too. Ron said, "Good to see you, Mrs. MS. Katrina laughed, and Ron's ears turned bright pink. She said, "You can call me Cat, Ron. My last name is Belmont, but my friends call me Cat. So, if my friends can say it, then I think Harry's can too. Any friend of his is a friend of mine." Ron grinned and said, "Okay, well then, good to see you, Cat." Katrina laughed, and Mary smiled, asking, "It really is great to see you. How have you been?" Katrina smiled and said, "I've been all right, much happier now that you all are here with me. Shall we head back to the house?" They all nodded, and Katrina said, "Right then, let's shrink all your luggage so it can fit into your pocket while we apparate back, minus the pets of course, hang on tight to their cages." She cast the shrinking spell on each of their trunks, and they each pocketed their now tiny and much lighter luggage, and Katrina said, "Good, that's done then. Now I want all of you to link arms with each other, so you can hold your pets with one hand, but yet still be able to hang tightly to each other, okay?" They all nodded and did as she asked. She held Harry's and Mary's arms, forming a small circle of them as they then apparated back to the house. A few moments later, as they entered the house, Ron and Mary were in awe. They had never seen such an elegant home. Katrina smiled and said, "I know, it is remarkable, isn't it? I hadn't been in a house as beautiful as this before Harry came into my life." Harry grinned and said, "Come on. I'll show you my room." Mary and Ron followed with grins on their faces, just as excited as he was. Katrina smiled as she followed them, her black cat right behind her. She picked him up and held him as he purred. She said softly, "It's good to have him home, isn't it, Knox?" He meowed, and she carried him in her arms as she walked upstairs to Harry's room. Katrina stood in the doorway as Harry talked excitedly to his friends. After a few minutes, her cat jumped out of her arms and she asked Ron, "Mary, are you ready to see your rooms for the next 2 weeks?" They both nodded excitedly, and Katrina smiled as she led them out of the room. She then said, "Ron, your room is right next to Harry's. Go ahead inside and I'll be there to unshrink your trunk in a moment, okay?" Ron nodded, and as he opened the door, he exclaimed, "Bloody hell. This is my room." Katrina giggled as she said yes. Ron shouted, "Wicked." She laughed, as did Mary. She then turned to Mary as she led her to the room next to Ron's. She turned to Mary and said quietly, "Listen, sweetie, I know things haven't been easy for you at home, and I have a feeling that you aren't treated as well as you should be. Am I right when I say this?" Mary hesitated, but nodded slowly and softly, staring at the floor sadly. Katrina bent down, and gently put her hand on the girl's shoulder. She said, "It's all right, dear. It's nothing to be ashamed of. I had a friend when I was your age who had a very similar living situation. But you know what? He had a place he could go to whenever things got too much at home. And from now on, you have one too. This room is a place that you're always welcome to come to when you need it. Okay?" Mary's eyes widened, and she nodded, her blue eyes beginning to fill with tears. Katrina smiled and hugged the girl before she let go and said, "Go ahead in, Honorable." Mary opened the door slowly, and what she saw made the tears trail down her pale face. It was a beautiful, pale yellow that made it feel like a room filled with sunshine. There was a bed with a pale blue shaded quilt, but had a beautiful gold sun in the middle as the design that seemed to sparkle and shine, made from an enchantment Katrina used. There was a bookcase filled with Muggle books that she thought Mary might like to read, a desk, and a large armoire, all of which were white, including the bed frame. There was a small bathroom connected to the room as well. The ceiling had little stars that seemed to glisten slightly, as though it was a real sky up above. In the middle of the room, there was a tall tree decorated with colored lights, gold tinsel, and white, gold, and pale blue ornaments to match the room, and a shimmering gold star at the very top. The room was so warm and inviting, Mary couldn't believe that this was for her. Katrina smiled as she asked, "Do you like it?" Mary turned around, tears now flowing down her cheeks as she ran to Katrina and hugged her as she said, "I love it. Is this really for me?" Katrina's own eyes had tears in them as she said, "Yes, sweetie. It really is. You deserve it." Mary smiled as she wiped her tears on the sleeves of her worn-looking jacket. Katrina made a mental note to find out her clothes size for later. She then said, "Well, let's go ahead and unshrink your luggage, yes?" Mary nodded, and pulled the tiny trunk out of her pocket and put it on the floor. Katrina non-verbally cast the unshrinking spell, and said, "All right dear, I should go help Ron with his trunk as well. Take your time and unpack, shower if you'd like. Dinner should be ready in an hour, okay?" Mary said okay. "Cat?" Katrina asked home. Mary said thank you. Katrina smiled, "Of course. You deserve to be taken care of, you know. Don't let anyone tell you different." Mary smiled, and Katrina closed the door almost all the way but left it open a bit in case Mary feared that she would lock the door. She remembered that Sirius too had that fear of being locked in due to how he was raised. She hoped she could take away at least a little of that anxiety for Mary as well. She knocked on the door before entering Ron's room. Ron answered yeah, as she walked in, and she saw him laying on the bed looking up at the ceiling that was enchanted to look like a starry night sky, just as Mary's did. She said, "Hello Ron. You like your room, I take it?" Ron said with a grin, "It's brilliant, thank you." She looked around once again, noticing the navy blue shade of the walls, and the dark wood furniture, including a bookcase with some books about Quidditch, desk, a chest of drawers, and the bed frame. His bed had a crimson and gold striped quilt, with an enchanted Gryffindor crest on it. This room also had its own small bathroom like the other rooms. The Christmas tree in Ron's room was similar to Mary's in the sense that it coordinated with his room. It had white lights, silver tinsel, and red, gold, and navy blue ornaments with a large silver star atop the tree. She replied, "You're very welcome, Ron. Ready for me to unshrink your trunk now?" He nodded and pulled it out of his pocket and put it on the floor. She cast the unshrinking charm non-verbally once again, and he asked, "Are you sure I can have this room? I don't mind sharing with Harry if someone else needs a room." Katrina looked surprised, and she sat on the bed next to Ron. "Why, hun? Do you not like your room?" Ron's eyes widened as he said, "It's amazing, but I feel, well, weird having a whole room to myself, I guess." His ears turned pink, and Katrina smiled and said, "I know things work a little differently at your house, and you have to share a lot with your brothers and sister. Your mum and I keep in touch quite a bit. But listen, this is a room that you can have all to yourself whenever you want or need it, okay? If you don't like it or if it feels too uncomfortable, you don't have to use it, and it's there for whenever you're ready." Ron nodded, and she smiled at him as she patted his hand and said, "And now, I will leave you to unpack your things. Dinner will be ready in an hour, okay?" He smiled and said, "All right, thanks." She smiled back and said, "Of course." She closed the door quietly, and then went to Harry's door and knocked. Harry said, "Come in." She opened the door, and said, "Hey, sweetie. You like the changes I made in your room too?" Harry grinned and said, "They are brilliant, Mum." "Thanks." She made his quilt similar to Ron's, but it was just crimson with the Hogwarts crest that seemed to be animated. Harry's tree in his room was tall, had colored lights with gold and red tinsel, and gold and red ornaments to match the colors in the room. She sat down on the bed next to Harry, wrapping her arm around his shoulder. Katrina said, "Your friends seem to be settling into their rooms nicely, and see. You thought you wouldn't make any friends this year." Harry said, I know, Mum. Thanks for everything." He hugged her, and she hugged him back with a smile. "You're very welcome, I'm happy to. I've missed you. Have things been going okay at school? Hagrid doing all right too?" Harry nodded as he let go of her and said, "Yeah, things are going great, and we see Hagrid every week for tea, sometimes Miss Mystic joins too. She said that you and her used to do the same thing." She smiled and nodded, saying, "We did. Your mum used to join us, and oh, it was always so nice." He always enjoyed the company, and sometimes your father, Sirius and Remus joined too. She suddenly had another flashback memory to one of the many visits to Hagrid's for tea. The 14th of October, 1975. Katrina, Aaron and Lily had been laughing together talking about their potions class on their way to Hagrid's hut. Aaron said, "Oh, you should have seen Malfoy's face in class today when his potion backfired and his face turned bright orange. The look he gave Sirius was deadly, but no one could take him seriously because he looked as bright as a carrot. Even that freakishly long blonde hair of his was tinged bright orange." They all laughed and Katrina said quietly, "It's kind of funny that happened to Malfoy today, because just yesterday he called me after Transfiguration when I walked past him and his friends." Lily said as she linked arms with Katrina, "Well, the Pratt deserved it. I hope you don't take what he says to heart, Kat. He's just one of those stuck-up purebloods who thinks he's better than everyone else. Severus is no better, and he's a half-blood." Aaron nodded, and said, "Yeah, and next time I see either of them, I'm hexing them, and neither of you are going to stop me." They all giggled together, and Katrina knocked on Hagrid's door as soon as they reached it. Hagrid opened the door, and said, "Well, hello there. Nice to see ye all, come on in." They all grinned and said hello Hagrid, as they entered his hut. "Back to where we were. Mum. You okay?" Harry asked. Katrina asked HM. "Oh, yes. Just thinking about one of those visits actually. Sorry dear, sometimes I get carried away with my memories. Well, I'd best get back to finishing up dinner. Would you hand me your trunk, dear? I'll go ahead and unshrink it for you so you can unpack your things before dinner." Harry handed Katrina the tiny trunk, and Katrina cast the spell after setting it on the floor. "Thanks, Mum," Harry said with a smile, and Katrina replied, "Of course, dear. I'll see you in about an hour then, yes?" Harry nodded as he began to unpack his things. Katrina smiled as she left the room, closing the door behind her. About an hour later, Katrina had the table set with bowls of vegetable stew, a basket of dinner rolls, and a lovely large salad. The kids all ate happily, and Katrina made sure that they all got at least a second helping of the stew and plenty of rolls. After dinner, she asked, "So, before dessert, how would you all like to help me decorate the tree in the living room?" They all looked to her excitedly, and said yes, as they practically ran to the other room. Katrina laughed, and she followed them. Mary asked her before they began, "Kat, is there, a wrong way to decorate the tree? I've never done it before, and..." Katrina smiled, "No, Honorable. No matter how a tree is decorated, as long as it has lights, tinsel, plenty of ornaments, and the angel on the top, it will be beautiful. Just follow our lead, and you'll catch on." Mary nodded with a smile, and soon they all began stringing the lights around the rather large tree. Next, they strung silver and gold tinsel all around the tree. When it came time to hang the ornaments, McGonagall came in and asked, "Mind if I join?" Ron and Mary looked surprised, but Harry chimed in, "Auntie. Of course, we missed you at dinner." Ron asked aloud, "Auntie? What?" McGonagall smiled, and replied, "I'm sorry I missed it. Professor Dumbledore invited me to have dinner with him before we all went our separate ways for the holidays. Now, we may want to explain to young Mr. Weasley and Miss Black as to why I'm here." Katrina laughed as she said, "Okay you two, here's another thing that you cannot tell anyone. McGonagall is the reason why I got the chance to help raise Harry. She took him in, and due to her teaching duties at Hogwarts, she needed someone to look after him during the day, so she recruited me." Ron said, "Whoa." Mary added, "Well, this is, McGonagall said, "I know it's a lot to take in, but just think of me as a friend of the family. I'm not going to judge you based on your actions here, we are in a home and not at Hogwarts." Ron and Mary nodded, and Harry asked, "Well, shall we continue decorating, then?" as he handed a small box of ornaments to McGonagall. Katrina grinned as she said definitely, and began handing Ron and Mary each a small box of ornaments. They all decorated the tree, talking and laughing while doing so, and having a wonderful time. Each of them looked forward to Christmas Eve the next day. Chapter 27. After the kids all went to bed, and Professor McGonagall retired to her bedroom after helping Katrina clean up the living room and the dishes left from dinner, there was a knock on the door. Katrina thought, could that be Aaron? She opened the door excitedly and was happy to see her friend's smiling face. "Arin," she said happily as she hugged her. Arin giggled as she said cat, and hugged her friend back as she said, "Oh thank Merlin, I wrote down the address McGonagall gave me, otherwise I wouldn't have made it here till 2 weeks from now." Katrina laughed and said, "Hungry?" Arin said, "Starved." "Have anything left from dinner?" Katrina nodded and said, "Of course, I saved you a bowl of stew I made earlier with some rolls and a little bit of salad as well." Arin said, "You are a lifesaver." Katrina said with a smile, "No worries." "So, how many papers did you have to grade?" 100, as she reheated bowl of stew. Arin said, "At least 200. It was endless, Cat. It could have even been more than that, but I lost count after 140. Katrina chuckled as she said, "Oh Arin, that sounds like a long night, I'm sorry." Arin nodded as she rubbed her eyes tiredly. She pushed her dark hair out of her face with her fingers before beginning to eat. As she quickly finished, she asked, "How have things been for you lately?" Katrina answered as she rested her head on her hands, keeping busy as usual. "Been taking care of things here and fussing over Harry and his friends." She laughed to herself before saying, "But to be honest, things have been quite lonely here when everyone is away. I go to the market every day to enjoy the bustle and company, but other than that, without Harry or Minerva around, things are quiet and lonely except for Knox." Knox showed up at the sound of his name and brushed himself against Katrina's legs while meowing. She smiled as she stroked his soft, black fur. Arin finished her last bite and said, "Oh Cat, I'm sorry. I don't know how you do it, honestly. Merlin, it would be too silent for me to stand. You should visit Hogwarts more often. You're always welcome to hang out in my office with me when you need it." Katrina smiled as she said, "I may take you up on that, thank you. And if you need anything as well, please don't hesitate to owl me." Arin smiled too as she said, "I will for sure, or who knows. I might just pop over here now and then and be like poof." "Hey Cat, what's up?" Katrina laughed and said, "Well, to be honest, I wouldn't mind if you did." They laughed together for a minute before Arin yawned and Katrina said with a smile, "If you're finished, I'll show you to your room now." Arin nodded gratefully as they got up and walked down the hall. Katrina said, "All right, well, your room is right next to mine, so if you need anything just knock on my door. Towels are in the bathroom, and your suitcase is at the end of your bed. I'll see you in the morning, Arin. Happy Christmas Eve." Arin hugged Katrina before saying, "Happy Christmas Eve, Cat. Thanks for everything." Katrina smiled and said, "What are friends for?" Arin returned the smile and then went into her room. Katrina cleaned up Arin's dishes before retiring to her room. Knox followed her and curled up comfortably on her bed a short time later. Katrina brushed her teeth, pulled her wavy brown hair into a ponytail and changed into her long pink pajamas. Just as she was about to get into bed, she heard a tapping on her window. Startled, she ran to the window to find an enormous brown owl waiting with a letter in its talons. She opened the window quickly, took the letter, and said, "Wait a minute, if you please." She pulled a small treat out of her shirt pocket and fed it to the owl as it perched itself on her dresser. She opened the letter with slightly shaky fingers, and read it. "Dear Katrina, I know it's been a while, I'm sorry. I don't get very many opportunities to write as I often lack parchment and quills, but I managed to borrow one so I could write this to you in time for the holidays. Happy Christmas, love. I hope you're not alone for the holidays. I wish I could have visited, but I'm quite far away now. I found this lovely bit of country, and there's even a small Muggle village nearby where I can usually find something to eat. I found an abandoned barn not too far away where I'm able to rest comfortably, at least for the time being. I plan to be moving again in a couple days. Don't worry about me, though knowing you I'm sure you have been since I last saw you. Honestly, Cat. Stop worrying. I will be alright, I always am. Well, anyways, I just wanted to let you know that I'm safe and I wanted to make sure and wish you a happy Christmas. I hope you are well, my dear friend. Love. Snuffles." Katrina smiled, eyes blurred from tears that didn't fall. She quickly grabbed a bit of parchment and a quill and scribbled a quick note to him as well. Once she finished, she handed it to the owl and said, "Please take it to the man that sent you." The owl flew into the cold night air. Katrina watched it go as she closed the window before crawling into bed. She laid in bed with a smile, glad that Sirius was alright, and thinking about the day ahead of her. She had a few surprises in store for Harry and his friends, as well as for her friend. Knox curled up next to her legs, and she pet him as she fell asleep. About 2 hours later, Sirius had just gotten comfortable in a pile of hay and was getting ready to change into his animagi form for the night when the owl he sent only a few hours ago swooped into the barn and dropped a letter in his lap. He said thanks as he pulled a bit of bread from his pocket and put his hand into a flat palm as the owl swooped down again and took the treat. He opened the letter, and it read, "Dearest Snuffles. Happy Christmas to you, too. I hope you don't feel too lonely for Christmas. Though I'm sure you'll be able to enjoy this one since it's your first one that's not spent in, you know where. I can't wait for the day where I can give you a proper Christmas, it's been so long. I wanted to send you a present this year but I wasn't sure how to get it to you if I did hear from you, but I'll save it for the next one. I'm glad to hear that you are well. I have missed you so much, things have been pretty busy since we last exchanged letters. McGonagall and I are taking in some students from Hogwarts for the holidays so they wouldn't be spending Christmas alone. I wish you well, and remember, Snuffles, you are so loved, and someday soon you will be surrounded by loved ones again. Love. Cat." Inside the letter, there was a candy cane taped to the bottom of it. Sirius smiled, and looked up at the stars that sparkled in the dark sky as he said quietly Merry Christmas. Cat awoke early the next morning to prepare a huge breakfast for everyone, since they had a big day ahead of them, Christmas Eve. Cat had it all planned out that they would go Christmas shopping in town that afternoon and have a small lunch there before coming back and making from scratch hot chocolate. Then, later in the evening, she would prepare dinner and a special dessert, ones of Harry's favorites, and then usher all the kids off to bed before she wrapped up the rest of their gifts and put them all out under the tree. She grinned as she leapt out of bed at 6 o'clock and changed into a red t-shirt and jeans. As she pulled her hair into a quick bun, she thought about all the cooking she was about to do that day. Chapter 28. A few hours later, Arin and Minerva were helping to set the table, while the kids all awoke to the smell of bacon and sausages. They all leapt out of their beds and pulled on their bathrobes and rushed to the dining area to see a table filled with all kinds of breakfast foods to eat, freshly baked bread, bacon, sausages, scrambled eggs, fruit salad, and even waffles. Each place had a tall glass of pumpkin juice, as well as a cup of tea. They all looked in amazement, and Cat laughed lightly as she said, "Well, go ahead and dig in, then." You didn't have to tell them twice, they all took a little bit of everything and seemed to enjoy every bite. Katrina, Minerva and Arin soon joined them and they all ate happily and chatted as they did so. When they were finished, Katrina said as she drank her last drop of tea, "All right dears, go ahead and get ready, we've got a big day ahead of us." Harry asked, "Should we help with the dishes?" Katrina said with a smile, "Don't worry about it this time, Minerva and Arin will help me. You three had best hurry so we don't miss any of the shops, they'll close early today since it's Christmas Eve." Harry nodded, and Mary said, "Thank you so much for breakfast, it was amazing." Ron nodded as he drank his last gulp of pumpkin juice and said it really was. Katrina smiled as she said, "You're very welcome, I figured a big day starts the best with a big breakfast." Harry ran over and pecked Katrina on the cheek before running to his room, saying, "You're the best, Mum." Katrina smiled fondly as she watched him go off, and the other two run after him. Minerva and Arin smiled too, and Arin said, "He's so sweet." Then again, it's not surprising seeing as you are just as sweet. Katrina blushed a little, and said, "You're sweet for saying that, but no, I think he gets it from Lily." Minerva said, "You're right, of course, but Miss Mystic is also quite right. You raised him to be that way. Lily would have been proud." Katrina smiled at both of them for a moment, but then looked at the clock on the wall and said, "Oh. We'd better get moving if we want to catch the shops before they close." Minerva and Arin nodded and helped Katrina with cleaning up. Once they were finished, Katrina ran to her room and showered and changed into a lovely crimson sweater and a pair of jeans. She chose to wear a simple pair of dark brown boots with it. She left her hair down and pulled a gold-colored beanie hat on before putting on her usual necklace and earrings. She touched up her face with a bit of makeup and then rushed out of the room, placing a quick peck on top of her sleeping kitty's head before leaving. She pulled on her black peacoat as she waited at the door for the crew. As she waited, She thought about her last Christmas with James, Lily and the rest of the marauders. She smiled fondly at the memory, and soon it became a full-fledged flashback. The 25th of December, 1980. Katrina had 2 huge paper bags filled with Christmas presents that she struggled to carry to the Potter's door. She smiled with delight as she saw the door, and was almost to it when she slipped on a small patch of ice. She almost lost hold of her bags as she fell, but suddenly found 2 strong hands that caught her just before she hit the ground. "Careful," a voice said with a chuckle, and she smiled, and blushed slightly, as she recognized the voice. She turned around and said, "Phew, that would have been a mess." "Thank you, Remus." He returned the smile, and she put the bags down carefully in the snow before hugging him. "It's so good to see you," she said, and he replied, "It's good to see you too. It's been a while, hasn't it?" He returned the hug, but she heard a small gasp of pain when he did so. She gasped and quickly pulled away as she asked, "Did I hurt you?" her brows furrowed with concern. He said as he tried not to wince as he put his arms down. "It's nothing." She said, "Yes, it is. It's all over your face, Remus." He looked down, and she said, "Let's go inside and I'll have a look at it, please." He said honestly, I saw a bit of your arm as you pulled me up. Let me take care of it." "Okay. You shouldn't be in pain, especially not on Christmas." She looked up at him, her hazel eyes looking at his pale, troubled face and then into chocolate brown eyes, pleadingly. He sighed, and said wearily, "All right, thank you." She smiled. He smiled weakly back, and she picked up her bags and they walked to the door together. He knocked, and Lily answered it a minute later with a big grin. "Cat. Remus. Please come in." Katrina put her bags down and said, "Oh Lils, I've missed you. It's been ages." They hugged and Lily said, "I've missed you too." "Oh Merlin, I know. I can't believe it's been nearly 5 months." She turned to Remus and hugged him too, saying, "Good to see you too, Remus. You doing all right?" Remus winced slightly, then said, "As all right as I can be, I suppose." Lily said, "I know what you mean." They then shared a small smile. Lily turned to both of them and said, "Well, come on in the living room. We're all just enjoying some hot chocolate and Christmas cookies, my mum's old recipe." Katrina smiled and said, "That sounds amazing. We'll be right there." Lily nodded and smiled before going back to the living room, and Katrina walked over to Remus and asked quietly, "Is it okay if I roll up your sleeves?" Remus nodded hesitantly, and she did so, carefully. She winced as she looked at his arms. They were covered with scratches, a few bruises, and some deep cuts. She said quietly, "Oh my God. Remus. I don't know how you aren't screaming in agony." Remus looked down, and she gently said, "Hey, it's okay. I'm not lecturing you, I'm just worried. You know me, I'm a worrier." He nodded, his eyes looking quite sad. He looked broken. She didn't know why or what he had been through since they all graduated, but she wished she could help. She sighed, and gave him a sad smile. She momentarily put her hand on the side of his face out of comfort, then got to work. She took out her wand and muttered healing charms, and soon the cuts and scrapes across his arms faded away. Remus said quietly, "Thank you, Katrina. You really didn't have to, I should have done that myself, I just didn't come." She said, "We all need a little help sometimes. Don't worry about it, all right? That's what friends are for." He hugged her, and with a surprised look, she returned the hug, and smiled. He let go of her after a minute, with a slight blush in his cheeks. She blushed furiously, and tried to hide it by giving him a quick smile and running to get her bags while saying, "We should probably go to the living room now before Sirius starts telling everyone that we were snogging in the closet," with a nervous laugh. He chuckled as he rolled his sleeves back down and said, "Sounds like him, all right. I'll go ahead in, then. And Cat." She turned around with a hum. He looked as if he wanted to say one thing, but ended up saying, "Well, thanks again," with a small smile. She nodded, and returned the smile, but couldn't help wondering what else he was going to tell her. Nevertheless, she joined him in the living room with her big bags of presents, which she put down in front of the tree. Sirius got up and hugged her, and she was then hugged by James, who was holding Harry. She took Harry's little hand with her finger and held it as she said, he's gotten so big already. He definitely looks like a mini James, but those eyes are definitely yours, Lils. Lily and James grinned at her and then smiled fondly at each other, and James asked, would you like to hold him? Katrina said, I would love to, with a smile, and she sat down next to Sirius as James put Harry gently in her arms. She grinned and rubbed her nose softly against his little nose. He cooed and giggled, and she tickled him gently. She laughed as his laughter filled the air. Sirius then joined in and made funny faces at Harry and tickled him lightly as well. Remus seemed to be transfixed with a look of adoration in his eyes, directed at Katrina and little Harry. Sirius noticed, and grinned. He winked, and Remus quickly looked away, this time instead looking at James and Lily. The couple held each other, and watched their friends enjoying Harry. He smiled before joining Katrina and Sirius, opting to sit on the floor. As he sat down, Katrina asked Harry, do you want to see your Uncle Remus now? Sirius said, that's Uncle Mooney, we don't use our names with him. Just Uncles Padfoot, Mooney, and Wormtail. Still working on him to say Padfoot instead of Parfoo. They all laughed, and Harry cooed as she gently handed Harry to Remus. Remus talked to Harry and bounced him gently on his leg. Katrina watched with a grin on her face, thinking how adorable they both looked. Back to where we were. Cat. Kite? Aaron asked. Home. Oh, sorry. I had a bit of a flashback. Back to the last time I saw James and Lily. Katrina said. Aaron frowned slightly, and Katrina continued, it was a happy memory, though. It was right about this day that I saw them last. Remus and Sirius were there too. The two smiled at each other, and Harry, Ron, and Mary all came down the stairs in their winter coats, ready to go. Mary's coat had countless holes in it, and didn't look very warm at all. Katrina frowned slightly, then asked quietly, Mary, can you come to the kitchen with me for a moment? Mary looked nervous, but did as she was asked. Once in there, she turned around and asked, did I do something wrong? Her eyes filled with tears as she trembled slightly. Katrina looked surprised as she said, of course not. She suddenly remembered, the tone she used is probably what her mother used, and usually those conversations would end up with Mary being punished. She remembered seeing many bruises on her arms the last couple of times she had seen her. Katrina quickly said, oh. Mary, I'm sorry. I hope I didn't scare you. I'm sorry. She hugged Mary, who sniffled and tried not to sob. Katrina continued, saying, oh sweetie, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to sound like I was going to lecture you or anything like that. You haven't done anything wrong, okay? I promise. Mary nodded, and sighed in relief. Katrina let go of her, and handed her a tissue as she said, I just wanted to fix you up a bit before we go out, okay? Your coat is all tattered, and it won't keep you warm with all those holes in it. I have a charm that can fix it right up. Don't want you to catch a cold for Christmas. Mary wiped her tears with her sleeve, and nodded with a small smile, as she said okay. Katrina pulled out her wand, and said quietly, Reparo, and Mary's coat transformed in front of their eyes. The pale blue coat soon looked brand new. Mary grinned, and said thank you. You don't have to be so kind to me, Katrina interrupted and said, yes, I do. You need kindness in your life, Mary. Everyone does. I know you're not treated very well at home. I've seen your arms, dear. And I see it in your face. But here, you will always be treated with kindness and love. Mary hugged Katrina once again, and Katrina smiled and returned the hug. She said, remember, everyone that is good of heart deserves love and kindness. Do not let anyone make you feel that you don't deserve those things. If they make you feel like that, then they aren't the sort of people you should keep in your life. All right. Mary nodded, and they released the hug and left the kitchen together. Aaron asked, are we all ready? Katrina nodded, and the kids all grinned. Harry asked, is Auntie going with us? Katrina said no, dear. She said she needed to stay back today to get some chores done. Harry nodded, and they all went out. They used a small Christmas tree that was on the lawn of the house as a portkey to get to Diagon Alley. And with a whoosh, they were off. Chapter 29. Katrina, Aaron, Harry, Ron and Mary all walked together through Diagon Alley in awe at the wintry sights and smells. The smell of snow was in the air, the faint smells of freshly baked gingerbread and hot cocoa were also prominent. There was a hustle and bustle of all kinds of wizards and witches alike trying to get their last-minute Christmas shopping done. Harry, Ron and Mary all grinned as they took in the sights and sounds. Katrina asked, "Right, so, we've got 2 hours, where did you want to look first?" The kids all looked around, and Harry asked how about the bookshop. Ron and Mary nodded in agreement, and Mary added always a good place to start. Books are often great gifts, or if not, they are almost always useful at some point. Ron nodded and said that was the case with my brother Charlie. Bill had this book about dragons that someone gave him that he never really read, and when Charlie found it in their room when they were kids, he thought it was brilliant. Now he works with dragons in Romania. Katrina smiled, and said that's quite a dangerous profession. I'm sure your mum worries a lot about him. Ron nodded, and Aaron said with a grin, well, what are you waiting for? The lines will be huge if you lot don't get a move on. Mary giggled, and the 3 kids ran to the shop. The 2 women watched them go, and smiled. Aaron said, all right, Spill. What's up with McGonagall not joining us? Katrina laughed lightly and said, well, to be honest, I have no idea what she's up to. She said she had some last-minute things to take care of before Christmas. Aaron said, that sounds awfully suspicious, I wouldn't be surprised if she... Suddenly, a snide voice interrupted, Katrina Belmont. She recognized the voice immediately, and her body tensed as she turned around and replied coolly, hello, Lucius. He said with a smirk, "'Tis a pleasure to see you today, enjoying your Christmas Eve?" Aaron said, well, frankly, we were until we heard your voice. He stared at Aaron and said, Miss Mystic, I hear you're teaching at Hogwarts these days, couldn't seem to stay away from school, eh? I hope you're better at teaching than you are learning your place. Aaron glared, and was about to say something when Katrina, with slight anger in her voice, "Leave her alone, Lucius. What do you want from me?" He said as he tapped his cane on the ground, always wanting to get straight to the point. "I like that about you. And you always stood up for your friends, even when you could barely stand up for yourself when you were in trouble." She glared, and he smiled. He chuckled then, saying coldly, "And nothing has changed. You still have a sickening desire to care for others, especially blood traitors, when you yourself aren't much better off, are you, Muggle-born?" Katrina said sharply, "Nor have you changed, still bullying people to get whatever twisted satisfaction you get from doing so." Aaron walked over to stand with her friend, and said, "And still being a snake-like, self-serving ass in general, I see. Yes, you're right for once when you say that things don't seem to change." "Do they, Malfoy?" Lucius smirked as he said, still trying to be witty and sharp-tongued, "Are we, Miss Mystic? It's rather pathetic." Aaron said coolly, "Well, frankly, you're rather pathetic." Katrina gasped and then stifled a laugh. Aaron finished by saying, "Now shove off to whatever nosy business you had before you ruined our pleasant Christmas Eve." Lucius stared down at her with a hard glare as he said, "You'd best be careful what you say, it could ruin your chances at keeping your position at Hogwarts." Aaron glared right back and said, "You don't scare me, Lucius." Lucius looked to Katrina and said, "We've been wasting time with this petty argument. Miss Belmont, you were pleading for Mr. Black's release the last time I saw you at the Ministry, were you not?" Katrina glared, and Aaron asked defensively, "Why is any of that your concern?" Lucius said bluntly, "I heard some rather interesting news. It appears that Mr. Black has somehow escaped. I was hoping Miss Belmont could enlighten me whether or not she was an accomplice, since the two of them were so very close, and coincidentally hasn't been seen since around that time." Katrina said, "Not that it is any of your business, Lucius, but I have no idea where he is or what he is doing. I hope you aren't suggesting that I helped him." Lucius said, "You were very active about pushing the Minister of Magic to find proof of his innocence." Katrina said angrily, "Listen, not that you would understand, but he needed to know that someone believed in him, so yes, that someone was me. I believed in him. You would be lucky if someone did that for you, Lucius Malfoy, after all your callousness. I live alone, and I prefer to do so. I lead a private life. I have no secrets that would affect the Ministry in any way, nor am I or have ever been a lawbreaker. Lucius was quiet, and Katrina continued furthermore, I'm glad he's no longer rotting in that hellhole, and I'm sure as hell glad that you are just as clueless as I am about his whereabouts. Now go, and enjoy your Christmas with your family. I hope you treat them better than you treat everyone else. He stared down at her coldly, and hissed, you'd best be careful, Katrina. For your sake, I hope you keep to your quiet, law-abiding life. If you don't, well, you would regret it. One day, Sirius Black will be back in Azkaban, I will make sure of it, and you nor anyone else will get in my way. He muttered as he started to turn away filthy mudbloods. Just as he was about to leave, Arryn slapped him across the face. Lucius grabbed Arryn's arm, and stared at her coldly for a moment before letting go, and walked away. Katrina was shocked, and Arryn smirked as she turned to Katrina and said quietly, that felt bloody amazing. I've waited ages to do that. Katrina watched Lucius gather his son from a different shop, and he gave her one last cold look over his shoulder before he walked further down the alley. She felt a chill in her bones all of a sudden. She knew one day things were just going to get even more ugly with him. She shuddered to think about it. Arryn put a hand on Katrina's arm, and said, Merlin, cat, you're shaking. Are you all right? Katrina nodded, took a deep breath, and said, that man has always frightened me, not that I will ever admit that to him. When we all were at Hogwarts, he would manage to corner me, and if it wasn't for you, Sirius, James or Lily, I don't know what would have happened. Arryn said, I know, we will need to practice our self-defense spells one day, I have a feeling we're going to need them. Katrina nodded with agreement, and said quietly, I surprised myself that I was able to say what I did, though. And I'm relieved he didn't see me with the kids, I don't want him knowing about. The door of the shop burst open behind them, and Harry came out asking, I need help with something. Katrina turned to him and said with a relieved smile, what was that, dear? I need both of your help. I want to get some things from the sweet shop for Ron and Mary, but I don't want them knowing. Can one of you distract them while I go to the sweet shop? Arryn grinned and said, but of course. Don't be too long though. Katrina said, I'll go with you, Harry. Harry nodded, and they went off. Katrina helped Harry pick out a box of Bertie Bott's every flavor beans and a couple of chocolate frogs for Ron, a couple of cauldron cakes and a box of sugar quills for Hermione, and a couple of pumpkin pastels and a box of sugar quills for Mary. Katrina bought Harry some sugar quills and chocolate frogs for Harry while he wasn't looking, and bought Arryn some exploding bonbon and fudge flies as well. Once they finished, they met in the bookshop with the other three, which Mary and Ron had already checked out with their gifts as well. As they made to go home, Katrina noticed that Mary looked longingly at the pet shop, especially at a tiny, scruffy-looking little owl in the window. Katrina quietly asked Harry, do you know if Mary has an owl? Harry thought for a minute, then answered, no. I don't think she does. She hasn't gotten mail before, at least none that I've seen. Katrina nodded, and whispered to Arryn to sneak to the pet shop and buy that little owl for Mary while she distracted the kids, and then to go to apparate back to the house so Mary wouldn't see till the next morning. A short time later, they all agreed to get a cup of hot chocolate before they left, and Ron asked, where did Miss Mystic go? Katrina answered, oh, she said she wanted to get something before we left, she said she would meet us back at the house. Don't worry, she won't miss out on hot chocolate, I'll make some later tonight. 'Tis the season. They all smiled, and bought their hot chocolates. After they finished and took one last look at the scenery in Diagon Alley, Katrina apparated the kids back to the house. A short time later, after they all piled in the house and hung up their coats, they each went to their rooms and hid their presents from each other. Katrina hid hers in her wardrobe, she had gotten them all a little something prior to that day, and smiled to herself as she couldn't wait to lay them all out tonight while they slept. She sighed as she looked out the window, and just then her cat leapt onto her desk and nudged her hand. She looked down at him and smiled as she stroked his fur. She said to him, "You're such a sweetie," as she kissed his nose. She said quietly as she looked out the window, "Remus, Sirius, I hope you're both safe and warm, and as happy as you can be." She wished she could see them again, but it wasn't the right time for any of them, as they were all in hiding. She hoped the day where they'd reunite wouldn't seem so far away one day. She snapped herself out of her train of thought and remembered that it was Christmas Eve, and she had a house full of guests, most of them being children. She ran out the door, her kitty following her as she began to prepare dinner. While she had dinner cooking, she planned out what they would do afterwards before they all had to go to bed. Just as she had finished planning, Erin came in and said, "It smells amazing in here." Katrina laughed and said, "Thank you, I could use some help if you've got some time." Erin nodded and said, "What do you need me to do?" Katrina said, "Okay, I need for you to knead that dough for about 10 minutes before we let it rest and put it in the oven. And after that I need you to take the ham out of the oven." Erin nodded and began to knead the dough. As she did so, she said quietly, "I put Mary's gift in my room for now, he's a happy little guy." Katrina smiled and said, "Thanks again for doing that. I don't think little Mary has anything except the clothes on her back and her school supplies. It will be nice for her to have some company as well. I may have to keep it here for her when she goes home. I hate the thought of her going back to that place." Erin looked to her friend sadly, and asked, "Do you know where her mum is? I can't believe anyone would want to mistreat a sweet little girl like her." Katrina nodded and said, "Me neither. I did see her a few months ago. She looks familiar but I can't place the name. I wish I knew. I wish Mary could stay with us during summer breaks, but I don't know if that woman would allow it." Erin nodded, and put the bread on the baking pan and set it aside. She wiped her hands and then took the ham out of the oven, and tested it to make sure it was done. Katrina sighed as she said, "Do you ever think about them?" Erin, who knew which them her friend was referring to, replied, "All the time. I hope they're all right. I've been worried, and since that night, it's just been absolute hell for them, I'm sure." Katrina, who was preparing the potatoes, looked sadly at her friend as she said, "It has been for all of us. I can only imagine how they feel. Rumus's condition, and Sirius's guilt, and the fact that he will probably be on the run for the rest of his life." Her eyes filled with tears, and Erin said, "Hey, it's Christmas Eve. They wouldn't want us to be sad. They will be okay. And we will see them again one day, I know it. For now, we have us, and McGonagall, and Harry and his friends. One day things will be the way they were meant to be." Katrina smiled and said, "You're right, thank you for that. It's easy to get lost in these thoughts when you're used to being alone these days. I'm very grateful for the company I have now, though." Erin smiled, and said, "I will make sure to start visiting you when I can. You shouldn't be alone all the time." Katrina said, "I'd really appreciate the company, dear friend. Now let's finish cooking, it's already getting a bit late." Erin nodded, and once they finished preparing the meal, McGonagall came in and said, "It smells wonderful. Is there anything I can help with, you two?" Katrina grinned and said, "Yes, if you could get the table ready I'd be very thankful. The kids asked about you today." McGonagall smiled and said, "I'll tell you about where I was later this evening once they're in bed." Katrina nodded and McGonagall left to prepare the table. Once all the dishes were ready, Katrina called Harry, Ron and Mary to the table. They all ran out of Harry's room, and went to their seats. Katrina smiled at all of them and they all sat down and prepared their plates and began to eat. They all talked and laughed and talked about Christmas and what they saw in Diagon Alley that day. Once they finished, Erin pulled out a box of Christmas crackers, and handed them out to each of them. They all broke theirs open and put on the silly paper crowns and began to laugh and read the jokes or sayings that they found inside. Katrina said, "These are what Muggles open on Christmas as well. My family and I used to get these every year." Erin joined in and said, "Mine too. The jokes are so silly you can't help but laugh." Even McGonagall, who wore a bright red paper crown, found herself laughing at the saying she found in hers. Once they finished, Katrina began making the hot cocoa as McGonagall sat down in the living room, near the fireplace, and began to read The Night Before Christmas to the kids, as she had requested. She grinned as she heard her favorite Christmas story being read aloud by Minerva, and pictured herself in her family's living room, listening to that tale being read aloud by her father. She looked at Harry's face, and smiled. She read that to him every Christmas, and he always enjoyed it. When she looked at Ron's and Mary's faces, who probably had never heard that story before, they looked so enthralled with the story that she couldn't help but smile wider. She poured the hot cocoa into small mugs, and put a candy cane inside each one, and handed them out as Minerva continued to read. As she sat down, her kitty walked onto her lap, and began to purr. Katrina smiled as she listened, and looked around at the people around her. What a beautiful Christmas Eve it was. Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night. Minerva had finished, and they all clapped and smiled. Katrina said thank you, we all enjoyed listening to you read. Before taking a sip of her hot cocoa. Erin sipped hers as well, and said yes. It brought back some memories for me. Ron said he must be a wizard to be able to deliver all those presents in one night. Bloody hell, even that for a wizard is near impossible. How can he do that? They all laughed, and Mary asked, I didn't even know you were supposed to get gifts on Christmas until this year. My family doesn't celebrate Christmas. Ron and Harry said what? The rest smiled sadly at Mary, who sipped her hot cocoa, her cheeks turning red that she had caused everyone to go silent. Katrina smiled and put a reassuring arm around her, and said, well, now that you know us, you will always have a gift at Christmas. We will make sure you spend every Christmas with us from now on. Mary looked surprised as tears welled up in her eyes, and said quietly, thank you. That's very kind of you. Harry said, what are friends for? Mary smiled at him, and then the clock in the living room struck 12. Katrina said, all right you three, if you want to lay your presents under the tree, go ahead and do so now before you get into bed. They all put their mugs in the kitchen and ran off to their rooms to get their presents. Katrina, Erin and Minerva all began to clean up the dishes. A short time later, Katrina said, I'll go make sure they're all in bed. Erin said with a smile, go on, we'll finish up here. Katrina smiled back and went to each of their rooms, knocked on their doors, and went in and said goodnight and tucked them in. First, she went into Harry's room. Harry said as he hugged her, this is the best Christmas ever. Katrina laughed softly and hugged him back, and said, I think so too, sweetie. Sleep well, I love you. Next, Ron's room, and he said, this has been really nice, thank you Harry's mum. She laughed and said, you're very welcome, and you can just call me Cat, Ron. Ron's ears went pink, and she said sweet dreams as she left. Lastly, she went to Mary's room. Mary was in bed, and when Katrina sat down on her bedside, Mary leapt up to hug her and said thank you. Katrina hugged her back, and said there's no need, we all deserve to have a happy Christmas. Mary laid back down in bed, and Katrina smiled as she said sleep well, dear. She closed the door, and went to her room and got all the presents out of her wardrobe and carried them out to the tree. Once she finished, McGonagall smiled as she said this will be a very happy Christmas indeed. Katrina heard a tapping on the window from her room, and saw a large owl carrying what appeared to be a heavy load of packages. On top, there was a note from Molly Weasley. Katrina thanked the owl, and gave him a treat while she quickly read the note. Katrina. Here's a few goodies for the kids, and there's one for you too. Thank you for taking care of Ron while we're all away, I really appreciate it. Maybe next Christmas we'll sort something out to celebrate all together. Happy Christmas to you all. Love. Molly. Katrina smiled and wrote a quick note back to thank her. She sent it off with the owl and gave it one more treat. Erin asked, did all those come with that owl? They are bigger than the owl itself. Katrina laughed and said, I know. It was from Ron's mom, she's so sweet. She and Erin put them under the tree, and Erin asked, should I put Mary's gift in here now or should I wait till morning? Katrina said, let's wait, I think we should give it to her later tomorrow, I don't want to make Ron feel left out, even though he has his rat, but still. Erin nodded, and Katrina turned to Minerva and asked, so what was it you were going to tell us? Minerva smiled and replied, I had to do some shopping of my own today, and I got something for each of you. I got those three each something special, but I don't want to spoil it and risk them overhearing, so you shall see in the morning. Katrina and Erin smiled, and Katrina said, all right, then good night Minerva. I'll see you in the morning. She replied, good night, sleep well, both of you. Erin said, good night Cat, happy Christmas. Katrina replied, happy Christmas, Erin. They all retired to their beds. That morning, all three kids were in their PJs and waiting patiently by the tree when Katrina awoke around 7 o'clock, and she smiled as she tied her bathrobe over her PJs and said sleepily, happy Christmas, Harry, Ron, and Mary. They all replied in unison, happy Christmas. A short time later, Minerva and Erin too came out in their bedclothes and bathrobes, and they all exchanged happy Christmas before Ron asked, can we open our presents now? Katrina laughed and said, of course, all of you go ahead. They all excitedly handed each other their presents with their names on it. Harry handed Katrina her gifts, and Mary handed Arryn and Minerva theirs as well. When they all had their presents, they each began to open them. Minerva's gifts for the kids were the following. Mary received a beautiful, deep red knitted scarf that was enchanted with a warming charm for when she needed warmth, as well as a calming charm for times when she was anxious. She gasped and hugged it immediately when she opened it. Ron received a small, gold pocket watch that was shaped like a golden snitch, and it not only told the time, but when held would activate a warming charm on colder days, and an encouragement charm when needed. When he opened his and found out what it does, he said wicked and grinned. Harry received a silver locket with his initials engraved on the front, and when he looked inside, he saw a picture of him as a baby in his parents' laps, and the picture wasn't just any picture, it moved. He saw himself being wrapped in his mother's arms, and his dad holding his little hand. Both of them looked at the camera, and smiled widely as baby Harry looked very happy too. Harry grinned up at Minerva and looked at the locket in awe. He hadn't seen a picture of his parents before. He had heard all about them from Katrina, Minerva, and Hagrid, but now he just stared at their faces. His mum really did have brilliant red hair, and stunning green eyes. His dad had a messy mop of black hair, and hazel eyes that seemed to smile with him. He felt a tear roll down his cheek, and Katrina sat down on the floor with him and hugged him from the side. She said, "I'm sorry we never had any pictures to show you of them. I always wished I had taken pictures with them, especially when you came into my life. I'm glad Minerva did this for you, so now you'll have a little piece of them close to your heart, and know just how much you were loved by them." She kissed his forehead, and Minerva put a hand on his shoulder and said, "I'm very pleased that you like it, Harry. Your parents would be very proud of you. I wanted you to finally have a little part of them to keep with you when you need them." Harry smiled at them both, and Ron, Mary, and Arryn smiled at Harry as well. They all continued to open the rest of their presents. Harry, Ron and Mary all got their very own Weasley sweaters with their initials on them, and Katrina did too. Katrina had gotten them all their favorite sweets, a book each, and other small goodies. Minerva had given Katrina a black cloak with a gold shimmer that not only has a warming charm, but also has a disguise charm when worn that can last up to an hour when needed. For Katrina, that meant a lot, because that meant that she could be with Harry and not have to worry about being recognized. She had been lucky up to that point that she and Harry hadn't been noticed together, and whenever they were out they tried not to be seen together. Harry can't talk about where he lives, and she can't tell anyone except a select few that she had been raising Harry so they can both be protected. She smiled and hugged Minerva, and said thank you. Minerva smiled, and Arryn opened her gift from her now. It was a pair of black mittens with a gold shimmer much like Katrina's cloak. These not only had a warming charm, but also a charm that when activated by pressing a button that was hidden on the palm of the left mitten, can be used to signal for help. Arryn grinned and said, "That is so cool. Thank you, Professor." Harry had gotten Katrina her favorite sweets, cauldron cakes and sugar quills. He also had gotten her a book about the life of Helga Hufflepuff. Mary and Ron had gotten her each a magical bookmark that when placed in the book, it will show you what line you left off at. She hugged all of them and said thank you so much. I love all of these beautiful gifts. Arryn had gotten a joint gift from the trio of a box of sugar quills, a couple of cauldron cakes, and a few pumpkin pasties. Arryn grinned as she said, "Ah, how sweet. Thank you." McGonagall had received a joint gift from the trio as well, this time a beautiful little journal from Harry, and a box fizzing Whizbees from Ron and Mary. She gave them each a smile and said thank you, what kind, thoughtful gifts. I will treasure them. After they had all finished and cleaned up the wrapping paper mess that was scattered all over the floor, they all got dressed and helped each other make brunch. They all talked and laughed and celebrated, all of them happy that they had such a special day. What a Christmas this had been for all of them. Chapter 30, Raising Harry. A short time later. Once again, Harry, Ron, Mary, and Hermione were back at the Hogwarts common room, doing their homework. Well, except for Ron, who had after 20 minutes decided that he wanted to examine his collection of chocolate frog cards. Hermione looked at him with exasperation, and said, "Oh Ron. This isn't the time to play, we have our potions and transfiguration homework due tomorrow. I'm nearly finished with mine now, and you've barely even started." Ron sighed and said, "Honestly Hermione. I don't need you to tell me when I should do my studies, I will do it after I have some time to relax. Mary smiled as she rolled her eyes, and Harry stared at his paper, trying to focus but failed. His mind kept going back to their discussion before their break, about what the big, three-headed dog could be guarding. He thought about their conversation with Hagrid they had the day after. A day after their visit to the third floor. Harry, how are we going to ask Hagrid about this without sounding suspicious? Mary asked as they walked to Hagrid's hut with Hermione and Ron. Harry replied, I hadn't thought that far ahead, but something tells me he might know about it, and we can't ask Dumbledore. Mary nodded as the four of them reached Hagrid's door. Harry knocked, and Hagrid answered not even a minute later. He smiled through his big, black beard and said, Good to see all o' ye. Come for tea, have ye? I'll pew the kittler on, then. Harry said, Hello Hagrid. I'm sorry we couldn't make it last week. Hagrid said as he went to his kitchen, Don't worry about it, I know your studies are important. I'm proud of all of ye for keeping up with them. I'll be Hermione is the one keeping ye and Ron in line, eh? And young Mary too, of course. Hermione and Mary smiled, and Harry said I don't know what we'd do without them. Ron's ears turned pink as he said, well, Hermione could be less bossy about it, but yeah. Hermione grinned. Hagrid brought over 5 cups of tea, and a plate of cakes that were just a bit too hard, and sat down to join them. They all took their teas and sat quietly for a moment before Ron cleared his throat and asked, So, Hagrid. Did you know that there was a three-headed dog on the third floor? Harry, Hermione, and Mary all stared incredulously at him, while Hagrid spat his tea in shock, and choked. He sputtered out, Do ye know about Fluffy? Harry repeated, Fluffy. You called an enormous, three-headed dog Fluffy? Hagrid looked surprised and said, Wait a minute, all of ye know about Fluffy, how did that happen? Hermione quickly said, The stairs changed us to the third floor, and we were looking for a professor to help us get back to our common room when we accidentally came into the room where Fluffy was. Mary nodded, and added, We were so scared, we all ran out of there as fast as we could. Hagrid looked sympathetic and a little suspicious, but seemed to accept the story. He replied, I see. I know he can be very intimidating, but he's really a good dog. Bow him off a Greek chappie I met in Tepub years ago. He was just a wee little pup then, so cute, and I just had to name him Fluffy. He won't hurt ye, but he don't like being disturbed unless I'm around. He don't get many visitors. All he needs is some soft music, and Tha will pew him back to sleep. They all stared at him, and nodded. He looked a bit nervous as he asked anyone want any more tea, as he picked up his teapot quickly. Harry spoke up, and said as he lifted his cup to Hagrid, But why would he be in the castle? Is he guarding something? Hagrid nearly choked on his tea once again, and said, Well, I can keep him out here. He's a big dog, and this hut is too small for him. He don't like sunlight either, so I have to keep him in there where it's dark and cool enough for him. Harry nodded, and pressed on, I see. But Hagrid, is he guarding something in there? I saw a door underneath. Hagrid interrupted, I can answer I'm sorry, it's not something I can discuss with ye, Tha's between Dumbledore and Nicholas Flamel. Hermione asked, Nicholas Flamel? Who's that? Hagrid got up and said, Now don't ye start, I'm no supposed to talk about him either. I shouldn't have told any of ye anything. Don't ask any more questions about Fluffy and what he's guarding, and not about Flamel either. All right. And don't ye talk to anyone else about it, it could get all 4 of ye in trouble. It could get me in trouble, and I could lose me job. I don't want any of Tha to happen. All 4 of them nodded solemnly, and Hagrid sighed as he sat back down. Fang came over and rested his face on his leg, whimpering slightly. Hagrid pet him as he looked as if he was at war with himself. Mary said quietly, We're sorry, Hagrid. We didn't mean to pry, we were just curious. We won't bring it up again, and we won't look into it any further. They all nodded, if not a little reluctantly, and Hagrid looked at them with a small smile, and said thank ye. Soon they were all discussing Quidditch, but none of them would forget that conversation, and the information that Hagrid had accidentally let slip. Back to where we were. Harry. Harry snapped out of his memory home. What is it? He replied. Ron said, Bloody hell, what were you so lost in thought about? You were staring at my cards for ages. Did you want to look at them, or something? Harry shook his head, and said quietly, sorry, I was thinking about that day with Hagrid where we talked about Fluffy, and... Hermione interrupted, saying softly, Nicholas Flamel. I was thinking about that earlier. Did anyone do any research during Christmas break? I couldn't find anything in our library here when I got back, and I have no way of getting into the restricted section to see if there's anything there. Ron interrupted, saying, oh, by the way, Harry, here's your Dumbledore card that you got on the train. You gave it to me, but I have at least 3 of him already. Harry said thanks as he accepted the card, and flipped it over mindlessly to read it, and as he read the card, he noticed the name Nicholas Flamel. Ron. You're a genius. Hermione, look. Harry exclaimed quietly, and Ron looked through his deck to find his Dumbledore card, and grinned. Hermione read aloud softly, and his work on alchemy with his partner, Nicholas Flamel. Oh Harry. I know what book to get. I'll be right back, as she ran out of the common room. Ron said, where's she off to now? Mary said, well, you should be grateful she's not nagging you about your homework for the moment. Ron said, you've got a point there. The 3 of them laughed as they waited for Hermione's return. When Hermione returned, she carried a huge book with her. She said, I can't believe I didn't think of this book before. I was reading this over Christmas break, you know, for a bit of light reading. Ron exclaimed, saying, light reading? Hermione, honestly. Harry and Mary stifled laughs, as Hermione shot Ron a glare, and continued, anyway, here it is, Nicholas Flamel is the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone. Harry asked, the Philosopher's Stone? Mary and Ron didn't seem to know what that was either, and Hermione sighed in disappointment as she continued to read what the book said about the Philosopher's Stone. Ron exclaimed, he's 600 years old. Bloody hell. Harry said, eternal life. I can imagine there are a lot of people who would want that. But why would Hagrid mention Flamel, unless... Mary finished quietly, unless the stone is being kept here, at Hogwarts. Harry said, so that must be what Fluffy is guarding. And what I saw Hagrid take out of Gringotts, he thought to himself. They all stared at each other in awe at their discovery, and thought about why it would be kept here at Hogwarts now, after all this time. Chapter 31, Raising Harry. A few days later. When Harry got back to his dormitory after his last class of the day, he found a neatly wrapped parcel on his bed. Surprised, he quickly put his things down on the bed and picked up the package. He looked for any indication of who it could be from, and didn't find one. He then gently pulled the gold ribbon off and opened the box. What he found inside was something he had never seen before, and it was the strangest fabric. He held it up to get a look at it. It was a cloak. He was confused, as this cloak seemed different from any other, but he couldn't figure out why. He tried it on, and it seemed a bit large, but... Harry! Are you asleep or something? I don't blame you, that last lesson was so boring, I nearly, Ron was saying as he approached Harry's bed, but he jumped back in horror when he saw Harry. He did a double take and shouted, bloody hell, Harry! What in Merlin's beard happened? Harry said, sure. What's gotten into you, Ron? And then he looked down and exclaimed, whoa. My body is gone. Ron nodded and paled as he stared at Harry, still appearing to be without a body. Harry looked back at Ron sheepishly and said, oh. Sorry, Ron, as he pulled off the cloak. Ron's face flooded with relief, and said, oh, bloody hell, Harry. I come in and suddenly all I see is your head floating around. I wondered how in the hell were you still alive. Harry tried not to laugh, and was thankful it was just them in the dormitories at the moment. He didn't really know how to explain this to anyone else. As Ron breathed a sigh of relief, he noticed a piece of paper on the floor next to where Harry was standing. He picked it up and handed it to Harry, saying, you must have dropped this. Harry replied thanks as he read the note, which said, your father left this in my possession when he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well. Harry wondered who it could be from. His father used this cloak too. It felt foreign for him to think about his dad, as he hadn't known his father or any father figure in his life. Hagrid seemed to be the closest thing he had to one. He handed Ron the note too, and Ron said, this is your dad's invisibility cloak. Wicked. I don't know how he could have gotten this though, these are really rare. This may even be the only one left. I wonder who gave this to you. Harry replied with yeah, as he nodded and kept staring at the cloak, and trying to imagine his dad using it around Hogwarts with his friends. He smiled as he thought of all the antics he probably did using this, as his mum described he was quite a prankster. He and his friends even gave Peeves a run for his money. Though it seems Ron's brothers Fred and George had that honor now. Ron continued, but Harry, think about how many midnight snacks we could get from the kitchens using this. Or we can use it if we're late to class, and if the teacher asks, we could say that we were there the whole time. Ron grinned. Harry laughed a little, and said, I didn't think about that. Maybe. I heard from Mum that my dad got into a lot of mischief in his time here at Hogwarts, so he must have used this quite a lot. Harry now grinned too, thinking about the stories his mum used to tell him before bed. Later that night, Harry couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned as he thought about the cloak, and maybe what he could find out now that he had a way to move around unseen throughout the school. Maybe would he be able to learn more about the Philosopher's Stone? He could sneak past Fluffy and find out. He put his glasses on and stretched as he sat up in his four-poster bed. He looked at the clock on his bedside table. It read 1:30 in the morning. He sighed as he put his slippers on, grabbed his cloak from his trunk, and slipped past Ron, who was snoring loudly before turning over. He went to the Gryffindor common room sofa and sat in front of the fire to warm up a bit. He put a hand through his hair and adjusted his glasses as he thought about the cloak once again, and decided it wouldn't be wise to sneak past Fluffy himself. Who knows what dangers could be behind that door he's guarding, he thought to himself. He did decide, however, that when he visits Hagrid for tea in a couple days, he would find a way to ask about what's behind that door without revealing why he wanted to know. Maybe Hermione or Mary could help him sort out something. After he tossed around more thoughts about the Philosopher's Stone and Fluffy, he finally decided that it wouldn't hurt to test out his new cloak and take a walk to clear his head. He pulled the cloak over himself and slipped past the fat lady's portrait, who appeared to be sleeping and didn't notice that she was moved. It felt very strange for him to be under the cloak and know that he was invisible. He could see fairly clearly through the cloak. The material seemed to be translucent from underneath as well. He stepped as quietly as he could, and found his way through the holes without disturbing the sleeping portraits and paintings. He walked for what felt like an hour through the castle, not really knowing what he was looking for, but thinking a lot about his parents and how they probably walked these very same halls. He thought about how many times his dad used this cloak to sneak out and walk around the castle when he couldn't sleep too. He then looked around to see where he was, and when he saw he was at the end of the corridor, with only a single door in front of him, he decided he should probably turn back. Just as he turned around, however, he heard a sharp meow. He gasped as silently as he could, and when he turned around fully, he saw Mrs. Norris walking towards him. He panicked and walked backwards as quietly as possible, then remembered the door behind him. As soon as he heard Filch's footsteps and mutterings approaching, he opened the door as quietly as he could and slipped behind it. He prayed that he hadn't gotten himself into another Fluffy situation as he locked the door quietly. He listened at the door, and when he heard Filch stop at the door and try the lock, he said to Mrs. Norris, "Come, my sweet." It was probably just that good-for-nothing Peeves or another one of those damned ghosts again. If there's a student out of bed, we'll find him. Harry sighed with relief as he heard Filch pick up his cat and heard his footsteps get further away. Then, he found the courage to turn around and look at his surroundings, where he would be staying for the next hour or so before he would attempt to go back to the common room. It was dark that he couldn't see much, but he could make out a few windows with a lovely view of the night sky, and the dim moonlight shining through. He then noticed that in the middle of the room was a large, intricately detailed mirror. He adjusted his glasses and pulled off the cloak as he walked closer to the mirror to examine it. He looked in awe of it, and he looked at his reflection in the mirror to see how disheveled he looked from rolling out of bed and being under the cloak for so long. When he looked, however, he didn't see just himself. No, it couldn't be, he gasped and stared even more intently. He looked behind him to make sure he was truly alone in the room, and then he stared again into the mirror. He saw a beautiful young woman standing on his right behind him, with bright green eyes like his, and a smile that looked as if it could light up a room. He whispered, Mum." She nodded silently, and a tear trickled down his cheek. He then looked to his left behind him, and saw a young man with the same messy, black hair as his, and even the same smile as his own. He grinned at Harry, and Harry couldn't help but smile back. "Dad." He nodded to Harry, and Harry had never wished so hard that he could hug someone in his life. His parents were there, but yet they weren't. They looked so young, and just as Katrina had described them to be. They were smiling at him, and he couldn't help but smile back as a few tears streamed down his face. How was this possible? Raising Harry, Chapter 32. Harry wiped his tears with his sleeve as he wiped his glasses clean. As he put them back on, he looked for his parents in the mirror once again. When he saw them, he couldn't help but smile. For a moment, they weren't just stories before bed, he could see them. How his mum's eyes sparkled when she smiled, and how he really did look like his dad. They looked just like they did in the picture in the locket that Auntie gave him for Christmas. He had so many questions, so many things he wanted to know. His heart ached when he realized that they couldn't speak, nor were they really there sitting next to him. He glanced at their places behind him as if they were there, then looked back in the mirror, saw his parents' sad faces in the mirror. For the first time in a long time, he let himself cry. He let his tears flow freely down his cheeks as he sat in front of the mirror, feeling the loss of his parents for the first time. He had always wanted to know what his parents' mannerisms were and what their voices sounded like. And in a way, he saw a glimpse of their mannerisms now, but he would never be able to hear how they talked. They were gone. He had known that from the moment Katrina and Auntie sat him down at the kitchen table and explained it to him. But it didn't feel real until now. He realized how much he missed them, that he would never be able to know them except through other people's stories of them. He wanted so badly to know where he came from, what it would have been like to grow up with his parents. Why did his parents have to die? After a little while, he found he didn't have any more tears. He wiped his face on his sleeve and cleaned his glasses once again, and sighed. He sat there quietly for a few moments, just staring at their faces, memorizing every detail. His parents looked solemnly at him, and he said softly, "Sorry, I just wish I could know what it would have been like, you know." His mum nodded with what looked like tears in her eyes. They smiled weakly at him, and he returned the weak smile. He stood up, and said, "I'll be back again soon, I want to see you again without crying. I love you, Mum, and Dad." They smiled at him, and he turned to leave. He quickly put his cloak on before he changed his mind and slipped through the door to go back to the common room. As he started his walk back, he heard voices talking a short distance away. He was exhausted, but found himself walking toward the sound, and stopped short a few meters away. He couldn't see their faces, but he saw two figures in the hall across from the way he was about to turn into before he heard them. "Don't lie to me, Kirill, I know what you're up to. It's Professor Snape." Harry dared not to breathe as he started to step back slowly. "I don't know what you mean. What was Professor Kirill doing this late? And why was Snape after him? This is the third time in the past 2 months that I've caught you prowling around late at night searching. Severus, I don't know what you're talking about. IW was up late grading papers, that's all." Snape pinned Kirill to the wall, and Harry nearly gasped, but he covered his mouth in time. He dared not make one sound, if Snape caught him out of bed. "I will be watching you very carefully, Kirill. I know what you were up to tonight, and I'm here to tell you that you won't find it." Kirill whimpered, and said, "Please, Severus." Snape released his hold on him, and said, "If I catch you again, I will tell the headmaster himself that I have reason to suspect you, and what you were looking for." But what was Snape suspecting Kirill to look for? Harry backed away and turned as he began to walk quickly back to the common room before they departed. A short distance away, he heard Filch walking out of another hallway towards where he just left Snape and Kirill. He sighed quietly in relief, and hurried back to his dormitory. When he got in, he closed the portrait quietly and caught his breath as he took his cloak off. His heart was pounding loudly in his ears. What did he just hear? Snape is after Kirill for searching for what? It couldn't be what Fluffy was guarding, could it? Could Fluffy be guarding the Sorcerer's Stone as they discussed a couple months ago? Was Snape after the stone too? Is that why he's keeping an eye on Kirill, because he wants it for himself? His head was spinning with all these possibilities, and even though he was very tired now, he was also wide awake at the same time. He had to discuss this with Ron, Hermione, and Mary tomorrow, and see if they could get something out of Hagrid about how safe the Sorcerer's Stone really is, if that's what Fluffy was really guarding. He yawned, exhaustion finally setting in. He walked up the stairs quietly, and went inside the dormitory as quietly as he could. He stuffed his cloak into his trunk before he shuffled over to his bed, and fell to the bed, not bothering to take his glasses off and falling asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. The next morning, Harry awoke to the sound of his alarm. Bleary-eyed and groggy, he reached for his alarm clock to turn it off. He felt around for his glasses, and he couldn't find them. He sat up, feeling more alert, and asked aloud, "Ron?" Ron made a noise that he couldn't really distinguish, and Harry repeated, "Ron. I need help, I can't find my glasses." Ron said with a sleepy voice, "You can't find your glass of what?" Harry sighed, and said, "My glasses. I can't see without them." Ron said, "Oh, your glasses, right." He yawned and stretched before he got up and walked over to help Harry look. He suddenly said, "Ouch." Harry asked, "Are you okay?" Ron said, "I am, but your glasses aren't." "Sorry, Harry." He picked up the pieces and handed them to Harry. Thankfully, no broken glass, but the frame was broken in two, and the right lens was cracked. Harry sighed and said, "It's all right, it was my fault. I guess I forgot to take them off last night. I need to find someone to repair them, though. I can't go to classes like this." Ron nodded as he helped lead Harry to the bathroom. Harry got dressed and got ready the best he could manage. As they left the common room, Ron led Harry down the changing staircases to make their way to the Great Hall for breakfast. "Blind as a bat now, eh, Potter?" Draco Malfoy sneered. Ron glared, and Harry said nothing as they tried to ignore Draco and his friends as they walked. Crabbe chimed in and said, "Bet you can't see us now." Draco sighed and said, "That's what blind as a bat means, you oaf." Crabbe said, "Oh," as Draco said, "Poor pathetic Potter." "Well, you're pathetic anyway, this just makes you look like it even more." Draco and his friends started sniggering, and Ron said, "Oh, shove off, Malfoy. Go be a toa-rag somewhere else." Ron walked with Harry away quickly as Draco's retort was lost to the sounds from the hall. Ron and Harry found Hermione and Mary at the table and sat down across from them. Hermione asked what happened. Harry pulled his broken glasses out of his pocket, and showed them. Hermione made a tsk sound as Harry said, "I guess I was so tired last night I forgot to take them off, and Ron's foot found them this morning." Ron smiled sheepishly, and Hermione said, "I can repair them." "Hand them to me, please." Harry did so quickly, relieved at the thought of being able to see clearly again. Hermione said as she held the broken glasses in her hands, "Oculus reparo." She then handed them back to Harry, who gladly put them back on and said, "Blimey, thanks, Hermione." She grinned and said, "Just don't do that again, I could get in trouble for casting spells outside of class, you know." Ron had already started having his bacon and eggs with toast and jam when Hedwig swooped in with a rolled-up newspaper that she dropped in Harry's lap, and a letter in her beak. Harry petted her and said, "Good morning, Hedwig. Thanks for that." He traded her a piece of toast for the note in her beak, which she gladly accepted. She perched on his arm while he read the note. Ron asked, "Who is it from?" with his mouth full, and Mary giggled as Hermione rolled her eyes. Hermione said with an exasperated tone, "Ronald, it's none of our business, and besides, you shouldn't talk with your mouth full." Mary tried not to giggle anymore, and Harry smiled as he said, "Hagrid wants to meet for tea tomorrow afternoon." Hermione said after taking a sip of pumpkin juice, "Well, we have some questions for him, so that works out, doesn't it?" Harry nodded, and Ron took a large gulp of his pumpkin juice as he said, "We." "You mean you, I don't want to know what fluff." Mary said, "Sure. Not here, Ron. Later." Ron said, "Oh, you know what I mean. Why do we care?" Harry remembered the events of early this morning, and said, "Because it may have something to do with Professor Snape." "Yes, Mr. Potter." Harry turned around to find Snape himself staring at him. Harry said, "Oh, I was just talking about." Hermione chimed in and said, "Our homework for class today." Harry nodded, and he suddenly noticed Snape's knee was blooded. He stared, and Snape quickly covered it with his robes, and glared at Harry. He said, "Well then, Mr. Potter, I expect that your homework will be on my desk promptly at the beginning of class today. If not, I will begin to suspect that your recent conversation was about something that is none of your concern." He stared coldly at all four of them, and Ron gulped as Snape turned to walk away, limping as he did so. Harry watched him walk away, before turning to the other three. He said quietly, "I have to tell you something later after classes." They nodded, and they all finished their breakfast, and Harry feeling thankful that he did all his homework already thanks to Hermione's reminders. Chapter 33, Raising Harry. Note before we begin, this chapter is mainly about Katrina and Aaron, and their friendship with Lily, but towards the end we'll be back at how the four young Gryffindors are faring. I will be posting my next chapter as soon as I can. We're almost to the end of the Philosopher's Stone part of this story, and there's so much more to tell. Thank you so much to all of you for your patience and kind words over the years. You're what keeps me writing this story that has helped me through a great deal of my anxiety over the years. I appreciate you, and I hope you enjoy this chapter. Who knows, maybe once this story is finished I'll write another continuation story. Winking smiley pink rose cool cat. Back to Katrina. Katrina was reading a book in the living room. Well, attempting to, but she couldn't focus. She kept getting distracted by her thoughts and staring out the window. She noticed that the sun was setting, and the sky was a gradient of pink, orange and blue. Her cat was curled up next to her, sleeping, as she sighed and put her book down. As she was petting him, she kept thinking about Harry, and wondered how he and his friends were getting on at school. She also thought about Sirius and Remus, and what they were doing, and how they were doing. She knew they could take care of themselves, but she worried about them nonetheless, and it hurt that she couldn't communicate with either of them. She had promised 10 years ago that she wouldn't tell anyone where she was, and no one could know that Harry was in her care. She pushed that boundary enough already by telling Harry's friends who she was, and by showing up at Hogwarts on Halloween. What if she had been seen? She had been so careless, but she had missed Harry so much. But she knew that she couldn't be that reckless again. Who would have thought that she, of all people, would be hidden away from the world to raise the boy who lived? Sometimes she still can't believe that she was asked to do this, and to keep such a big secret. There have been many ups and downs, and times where she felt that she couldn't be the mum that Harry needed, that she wasn't good enough. But then she'd look into his bright green eyes, Lily's eyes, and she'd hear her best friend's voice in her head telling her that she was doing the best she could. Harry was such a beautiful boy with a wonderful soul, and had so much love in his heart despite all that he's lost. She loved him with all of her being. She also thought about her family often, and whenever she did, she felt a fresh wave of pain. She wondered if she did the right thing by obliviating their memories of her, but when she heard about what Voldemort and his followers were doing to Muggle families during the war, she was glad that they were out of his reach. She wondered if she would ever see them again, and if she did, could she restore their memories as if nothing ever happened? Her heart felt heavy, and her hazel eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, and she wondered how much longer she'd be able to take it. She was so tired of hurting, feeling invisible, and alone. She wished to be with her family again, to have her best friends back again, and to feel love that outweighed the pain that she had been struggling with for so long. When Harry had been with her all these years, she had been so focused on him, and it didn't leave much time for her to think about her feelings. Now that Harry was at Hogwarts, and though she kept in touch with Minerva, Aaron, and Molly, and of course Harry, through owls, it wasn't the same. She was alone in a big house with no one except her cat. Raising Harry was the best thing that had ever happened to her. She didn't know where she'd be right now if it wasn't for Minerva or Harry. She'd probably still be living in that little cottage, alone with the thoughts that consumed her, just as they are now. She thought to herself, how much longer will it be like this? How much longer will I have to wait here, hiding in solitude? Will I ever be able to see my loved ones again? Tears started to stream down her cheeks, and she wiped them away angrily, thinking, now you're just being selfish. Think about Harry and how his life will be for the years ahead. Voldemort may come after him again, and Harry cannot afford to be left unprotected. I need to prepare him, and let him know that he isn't alone. We will face it together, no matter what. Harry is all that matters now. She sighed once again as she got up, and was about to prepare some tea when she heard a slight pop at the front door. She ran to the door just as she heard a knock, and she opened the door and was immediately hugged by Erin, she said as she laughed and returned the hug. "You must be good at divination too, you have no idea how much I needed a hug right now." "Oh Kat, what's wrong? I'm so sorry it's been so long." Erin released her and closed the door as she linked arms with Katrina as they walked to the kitchen. Katrina sighed, then sniffled as she said, "When you have too much time alone, your thoughts get the best of you. I've been thinking about my parents, and the boys. I miss all of them so much." Erin nodded. "I do too. Here, I'll make us some tea this time." Katrina was about to object, but Erin ordered her to sit. So, Katrina sat in one of the chairs in the kitchen while Erin looked through the cupboards to look for tea, and then filled the kettle with water and put it on the stove. As she started it, she said, "I wanted to stop by and make sure that everything has been okay with you. It's been absolutely mad the past few months, and it's been far too long since Christmas." Katrina smiled and said as she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, "Please Erin, don't worry, I understand. I can only imagine having to tutor so many students at one time. You're amazing, though. I take it Harry and his friends are all doing well in their studies." Erin chuckled and said as she took off her brown leather jacket and put it on the back of the chair across from Katrina, "Somehow, I knew you were going to ask that. Yes, they are all doing very well. Harry is brilliant in all his classes, the only exception is potions, but I suspect that's not because of him, rather his professor." Katrina asked, "Oh. Is Sloan not teaching anymore?" Erin groaned as she sat down. "You didn't know? Severus Snape. And he's even more of an ass than he was when we were in school. I didn't think that was possible. I loathe being in there during his classes, it's sickening. Especially with Malfoy's kid, he's just as much of a jerk as his father was. And on top of that, Snape always favors the Slytherins, because also unsurprisingly, he's the head of Slytherin House." Katrina repeated with a groan. "Severus? A teacher? And the head of Slytherin House? That's surprising to me, on both counts." "Well, not the potions teacher part, I remember now that he was gifted when it came to potions. But I also remember he was not particularly kind to anyone except Lils and his fellow Slytherin friends, especially Malfoy. I wonder why Dumbledore chose him. He's a bully now, too. He picks on all students that aren't in Slytherin, especially poor Neville Longbottom. And Hermione, just last week he said something very hurtful to her." Erin exclaimed. Katrina gasped, and said, "That's inexcusable. Bullying children. How is he getting away with this? Oh Hermione, the poor dear. And poor Neville, I haven't met him yet, but I remember his parents from school. Alice was so nice, she would sometimes study with us, remember?" Erin nodded sadly, and said, "Yeah, it's awful what happened to them. We should try to visit them soon. Maybe I'll ask Neville if I could send an owl to his gran so we can ask for details." Katrina nodded and said, "That sounds like a wonderful idea." Erin smiled sadly, and said, "I wish it didn't go against school rules for me to hex Severus, I'd bloody love to do that. That GIT deserves it, give him a taste of his own medicine, eh?" Katrina chuckled and replied, "I'd not only pay to see that, but I'd also join you. After what he's doing to those poor kids. And my Harry, too." Katrina made a mental note to discuss this with Dumbledore at a later time. Erin said, "But in all seriousness, you know I'll look after them. I always talk to the students affected after class, and sneak them a piece of candy or two for good measure." Katrina smiled, and said, "You're brilliant, you know that." Erin returned the smile, and replied, "Yes, I do know that." They laughed and Katrina poured them each some tea now that it was ready. They each stirred in their sugar and milk, and Katrina got up to put out a plate of biscuits to go with it. As she put some on a plate, she asked, "How are you, Erin?" Erin took a sip of her tea, and sighed as she said, "To be honest, I'm really stressed, and worn out. I'm thinking of taking a break for a semester. I need to figure out a better system of keeping up with all the kids and their studies. I help with potions, defense against the dark arts, and transfiguration, and it turns out a lot of kids struggle with those subjects in their first through second years the most. I can't tutor all of them by myself, as much as I'd like to and have been trying to do this year. Maybe I'll get some 6th and 7th years to help me after their classes for some bonus house points or something. I'll discuss it with Dumbledore at the end of this term. Katrina sat back down with the plate, and put it in front of both of them before saying that sounds like a good idea. You can't take it all on yourself, that's too much. I'd help you, but my strength was never in those classes, it was only in charms and care of magical creatures, though I didn't do too badly in herbology either. Arin said, I remember helping you with your potions and transfiguration homework. You had the basics, you just needed a little help figuring some of it out, as a lot of my students do. I also remember Remus helping you with your defense against the dark arts studies as well. Katrina started to blush, and said before sipping her tea quickly, why yes, he also helped me a lot with my studies. Arin said as she sipped her tea and said and he also stared at you quite a bit, and you had a blush in your cheeks the entire time he talked to you, not that I noticed these things. Katrina's blush grew redder and said, Arin, I could say the same about you and Sirius, always flirting and arguing with each other. As I recall, you always having a blush in your cheeks when he was around. It was Arin's turn to blush, this time she was red as a tomato as she replied, I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about. Katrina smiled and said, but, back to the subject, you're such a natural when it comes to your studies, you always have been. Hermione reminds me of you at her age a bit, you always dropped everything to help your friends with their studies. Arin smiled back, and said Hermione is definitely doing that, but she is a lot better of a student than I was, she has top marks in every one of her classes. Katrina said, I'm not surprised, she'll be the brightest witch of her age, just like Lil's was. Arin nodded, I think so too. They sipped their tea in silence for a few moments before Katrina said quietly, do you remember that day when Severus called Lil's, you know? Arin nodded solemnly, and said what a day that was. I couldn't believe how James and Sirius acted sometimes. So full of it. Katrina replied, I know, but he did seem to try to be a better person after that. He was a good person anyway, and he had a lot of times where he showed that he cared about others more than himself, but sometimes he just lost sight of it and wanted to show off. Severus probably has quite a bit of resentment towards Harry due to the fact that Lily chose James over him. But James changed, and Severus didn't. Arin nodded, and said, I remember that day as if it were yesterday. Flashback to their 5th year at Hogwarts. Arin, Katrina, and Lily had all just finished their charms exam, the final one of the year. Arin sighed with relief as she said, I'm so glad we studied as hard as we did this last week. The questions ended up being way harder than I expected from Professor Flitwick. He normally doesn't make things this hard, but he is the head of Ravenclaw after all, so I should have seen it coming. Katrina nodded and replied, me too, and well, I suppose since we're 5th years now, he can't take it easy on us anymore, our next 2 years will be even harder. Lily groaned and said, and our OWL's results should be coming soon too, I expect. I've had it with all these exams. I'm ready to toss all my books in the lake and let the giant squid have a go. They all giggled, and Arin said, well, I don't know about you two, but I'm so hot that sitting by the lake and soaking my feet for a bit sounds really good right about now. Lily replied, I'm in. Katrina smiled and said, sure, why not? We can sit by the lake and pretend we're at the beach or something. Now's your chance to give those books to the giant squid, Lils. They laughed as they sat by the lake and all began to take off their school robes, socks, and shoes. They all loosened their ties and rolled up their sleeves as they made themselves comfortable on the grass. Lily and Arin began talking and laughing, and Katrina pulled out her favorite novel and began reading. She smiled, she felt relaxed with her friends by her side, it was a beautiful day, and a good book in her lap, nothing could beat that. A few moments later, they heard James, Sirius, and Remus's voices as they sat not too far away. Lily and Arin pretended not to notice as they carried on their conversation, but Katrina glanced over at them, especially Remus. She watched as he took out his book and started to read, and she smiled. Great minds think alike, she thought. When he glanced over and noticed the book in her lap as well, he gave a small smile. She blushed and was about to return to her book when she felt some droplets land on her cheeks. She looked at Lily, who grinned. Katrina exclaimed, Lils. You'll get my book sopping wet. As she quickly put the book back in her bag, and kicked a small spray of water towards Lily with her foot. Lily laughed and said that's it, as she kicked a big spray of water at Katrina, who gasped. They started laughing as they kicked water at each other, and Aaron was spraying the both of them with great kicks of water as well. This continued for a few minutes before they were all soaked. All three of them laid down in the grass in the sun not too far away to dry off. Lily sighed and said, well, I don't feel hot and stuffy anymore. Aaron and Katrina giggled, and Aaron said, me either. It feels so good to relax, I've been so stressed lately. Katrina sighed and replied, me too. I wish we could have more days like th. She noticed out of the corner of her eye many people standing around a tree not too far away. She sat up quickly, and looked where James, Sirius, and Peter were sitting before and noticed they were missing. Remus was frowning as he was still sitting there, reading his book. Aaron sat up and said quietly, bugger, not this again. Lily sighed and said, we'd better go stop them. Aaron said, but, Lils, things will get uglier than they already are between those three if no one at least tries to stop them. Aaron and Katrina looked at each other with uncertainty, but followed their friend. Remus watched as they walked over, his frown deepening. When they got over there, they saw Severus in the air with pink soap bubbles coming out his mouth, and he seemed to be choking. Aaron crossed her arms and glared at Sirius, and Lily shouted, hey! Leave him alone. James turned around, and grinned as he said, all right, Evans. Lily repeated, stop that. What's he done to you? James replied, well, it's more the fact that he exists, I suppose. As the crowd around them laughed, Katrina sighed and face-palmed, and Aaron continued to glare at Sirius and James. Lily said coldly, you think you're so funny, don't you, Potter? You're just an arrogant, bullying toe-rag. Leave him alone. James smiled and put a hand through his hair before saying, I will if you go out with me, Evans. If you do, I'll never point my wand in Snivellus's direction again. Lily looked even more frustrated, her face starting to turn red now, as she said, I wouldn't go out with you if it was a choice between you and the giant squid. Some people in the crowd laughed, and Sirius said, bad luck, prongs. Before they could react, Severus sent a spell directly at James. James now had a gash on the side of his face, a trickle of blood dripped onto his robes. Some people in the crowd gasped, along with Aaron and Katrina. He quickly cast another spell on Severus, and now he was dangling in the air, his robes now hanging upside down with him. Everyone now saw his scrawny legs and grey underpants. The crowd laughed, along with Aaron. Katrina and Lily tried not to, but Lily quickly composed herself and exclaimed, let him down. Anything for you, Evans. James said casually as Severus dropped to the ground in a heap of his own robes. He quickly got up, and just before he was about to cast another curse on James, Sirius said, locomotor mortis. Severus went flat as a board, and Lily was angry once again as she shouted, you bullying prats, leave him alone. She pulled out her wand, and pointed it at James and Sirius, who looked slightly intimidated. James said, Evans, I'd hate to have to hex you. She pointed the wand directly at him now, and demanded take the curse off of him, then. James sighed, putting a hand through his hair once again, and cast the counter curse. He said, there you go, Snivellus, you're lucky that Evans was here, eh? Severus, who looked beyond angry, spat, I don't need help from filthy little mudbloods like her. Katrina and Aaron gasped, and Lily, hurt apparent in her eyes, said calmly, all right, fine. I won't bother in the future, then. And if I were you, I'd wash your pants, Snivellus. The crowd laughed lightly, and then James shouted, his wand pointed at Severus, apologize to Evans, now. She said loudly, I don't want you to make him apologize. You're just as bad as he is, you prat. James looked in shock as he said, W what? I'd never call you a you know. She said, messing your hair up because you think it looks cool to look like you just got off of a broomstick, showing off with that stupid snitch, walking down corridors and hexing anyone that annoys you just because you can. I'm surprised your broom can get you off the ground with that fat head of yours on it. You make me sick, Potter. I don't want to talk to either of you again. Evans, wait. James called after her. She stormed off, Katrina and Aaron followed. Katrina taking one last glance over at Remus, who looked sympathetically, and she shared the same expression. She and Aaron ran to catch up with their friend. They followed her to an empty corridor, and when they found a secluded spot, Lily leaned against the wall, and slid down to the floor. She buried her face in her arms and sobbed, and Aaron and Katrina shared the same look of sadness. They knelt down beside her, each putting a hand on her shoulder. Katrina said, "It's all right, Lils. We're here for you." Aaron said, "If you need me to go hex Potter right now, I will. I'll hex that broom of his to go right up his." Lily choked on a laugh, but continued to cry. They both sat down next to her, and stayed with her like that for a good while. Lily eventually calmed, and Katrina put her arm around her shoulders as she said, "It's okay." Lily sighed, wiped her face with her hands, and said with a strained voice, "Sev is no longer my friend. I was kidding myself thinking that he was a good person, but now I see that he never was to anyone except me. Now he isn't even to me anymore." Aaron rested her hand on Lily's arm. "I will gladly hex him into next week if you ask, Lils." Lily smiled slightly, and continued, "And Potter, he acts so stupid, so full of it, and it's repulsive. I don't know why he thinks that if he acts that way that I would even think of going out with him, let alone like him." Aaron said quietly, "I don't know why guys think that being a GIT is cool and that we'll just go head over heels for it." Katrina nodded, and asked, "Are you alright, Lily?" Lily sighed and nodded as she started to get up. "I'm alright as I can be, I suppose. I don't really feel like going back to my common room though. I don't want to run into Potter like this." Aaron said, "Let's go to ours, then. I'm pretty sure they'll let you in. Hufflepuff is more lenient than the other house common rooms." Katrina nodded, and added, "We'll go to the kitchens first. I think you could use a tall mug of chocolate with extra marshmallows." Aaron said, "Yum. Sounds like a great idea." Lily, whose eyes were still puffy and face still pink, smiled, and said, "What would I do without you both?" Aaron grinned and said, "You'd be very bored. And chocolate-less," Katrina added. They both giggled as they linked arms with Lily on either side of her, and they all walked to the Hufflepuff common room. "Back to where we were." Katrina sighed and said, "It's weird to think that we'll never have chocolate together again. We did it so regularly the house elves would always have it out for us before we even got there." Aaron smiled and said, "I know. I know it won't be the same, but, if you want, we can go back to the kitchens and see if they still remember us after all this time, and maybe we can have some just like we used to." Katrina smiled and said, Would we be allowed to do that?" Aaron shrugged. "I don't see why not. I teach there, and you're a former student. I don't think it'd be too much trouble for a mug of chocolate." Katrina replied, "Well, I do have that cloak that Minerva gave me for Christmas. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to give it a try." Aaron giggled and said, "It's settled then. Next week, I'll send an owl and let you know when I'm free, and we'll do it." Katrina grinned and said, "I can't wait." Back at Hogwarts, Harry, Ron, Hermione and Mary were all on their way to Hagrid's after that note that Harry got at breakfast earlier that day. He had just finished explaining to them what had happened the other night, leaving out the part when he found the strange mirror and seeing his parents. After he finished, Mary spoke up first, saying, "So, you think Professor Snape could be after the stone too?" Harry nodded, and said, "This morning I saw that his leg was bleeding. It looked like he had been bitten." "That has to be from Fluffy." Hermione said, "Wait a minute, Harry. That's a very serious accusation. If you told Professor Dumbledore, do you think he would actually believe you?" "Probably not, but we have to do something. We can't just sit back and wait for him to actually get a hold of that stone," said Harry. Ron said, "Sure we could. So what if he gets it? What can the stone do other than make someone immortal?" Mary replied, "I don't think anyone should have that kind of power, especially someone like Snape who isn't a nice person to start with." Harry nodded, and said, "Yeah, and besides, who knows what it could mean for the school. I don't know about you, but I don't want him as a headmaster." Ron nodded, and Hermione sighed. She said, "We're going to break school rules if we do this, aren't we?" Mary nodded and said, "Most likely." Harry said, "You don't have to help me if you don't want to." Ron said, "Harry, you're our best friend. Surely you know by now we wouldn't let you do any of this alone." Hermione nodded, not looking very pleased, but said, "Yes, Ron is right, for once." Ron said, "Oh." Mary giggled, and said, "We're here for you, Harry." "What are friends for?" Harry smiled, and said, "Right, well, Then I suppose we should get this talk with Hagrid over with, then. They all smiled back, and Hermione approached the hut and knocked on the door.